After Emily Dickinson's passing, her quiet room remained untouched, as if waiting for her return. Drawers held hundreds of unseen poems bound with trembling thread. The window stood half open to the pale Amherst air, carrying whispers of a life lived behind veiled silence, where shadows guarded secrets no visitor ever fully perceived in that stillness after she departed forever. Welcome, wanderer of distant hours. Share where you listen from, joining a circle of voices across the world. If this tale moves you, kindly subscribe to help our chronicles continue. The faint sound that lingered in Emily's room after her passing is the same sound with which we open this first part, a soft and almost imperceptible murmur, as though the air itself remembered her footsteps and had not yet learned how to forget. From that lingering breath of silence, we step into the world that once surrounded her, not with haste, but with the patient stride of one who walks through history's dim corridors, holding a single candle. In those quiet streets of Amherst, where houses rested behind elms that swayed like great contemplative sentinels, time moved differently. Even now, if one imagines the dust rising along Main Street on a summer afternoon in the 19th century, one can almost sense the pulse of a small town living its simple rhythms, unaware that within one particular home, behind a pale door and a narrow stairway, a presence of rare and unsettling brilliance was already weaving itself into the fabric of American memory. This is the point at which our journey begins, in a town that never sought to be extraordinary, yet became the backdrop for a solitude that would one day resonate across continents. It is said by those who walked those Amherst roads long ago that light had a peculiar way of settling upon the Dickinson house, as if the sun paused each morning at its threshold to contemplate its own reflection in the window panes. Whether this was simple chance or some gentler mystery, no one could say, but the house itself seemed to hold a hush, a quiet that deepened with each passing year. Travelers would speak of it not with excitement, but with a kind of mild wonder, as though sensing something present yet concealed. And within its walls, young Emily moved softly, her steps already forming the rhythm that would accompany her into adulthood, a rhythm not of retreat but of inward turning, like the slow closing of petals in the evening air. When one imagines Amherst at that time, one must picture the horses' hooves on dirt roads, the shopkeepers sweeping their thresholds, the distant toll of church bells, and the subtle hum of life rising and falling with each season. All the while, the world within the Dickinson house grew quieter, as if preparing itself for the unfolding of a life shaped not by the expectations of society, but by the steady deepening of an inner calling. It may seem unusual to begin a story not with the vibrancy of youth, but with the atmosphere surrounding a person. Yet Emily's life cannot be understood otherwise. Her existence was intertwined with the textures of her environment, with the muted colors of the New England landscape, with the pale winters that seemed to hold their breath, waiting, perhaps, for her words to give them meaning. As a child, she would have known the scent of apple blossoms each spring, the crisp bite of early frost, the warm creaking of old wood beneath her feet. These simple elements were not just backdrop, but part of her earliest vocabulary, shaping the quiet sensibilities that would later bloom in her poetry. And even though she would eventually choose the boundaries of one room as the center of her universe, the world she carried within her was vast, filled with the impressions of those early days when the horizon seemed both close and infinite. To approach Emily's life is to enter a kind of gentle twilight, where the edges of certainty soften and the mind is invited to drift. She was not a figure who announced herself boldly. Rather, her presence was like a lantern glimpsed from afar, partially obscured by distance, yet undeniably shining. People in Amherst knew her, of course, but knew so little of her interior realm that she became, even in her lifetime, the subject of quiet speculation. Some found her elusive, others merely shy. but very few recognize the growing intensity of the poems she wrote in seclusion, each one a small fragment of her soul captured on paper. And so, as we begin this tale, we step not into the noise of history, but into the slow, deliberate unfolding of a life that defied simple understanding. It was a life composed of subtle gestures, brief encounters, and long periods of contemplation, like the slow accumulation of snow along a windowsill. The image of her solitary room hovers already at the edge of our vision, though we are not yet ready to enter it. Instead, let us remain for a moment in the threshold of her world, imagining her standing at the top of the narrow stairs, listening to the faint movements of the household below. What thoughts passed through her mind in those quiet instants? What emotions stirred beneath the careful stillness of her demeanor? We cannot say with certainty, and perhaps that is what gives her story its lingering power. Some lives are best understood through the questions they leave unanswered rather than the facts they present plainly. In this sense, Emily's life is like a page with words partially erased, inviting the reader to lean closer, to listen more intently, to accept ambiguity as a companion rather than a hindrance. As we move forward, this sense of gentle uncertainty will remain with us, guiding our steps as it once guided hers. If one listens closely, even now, one might imagine the distant echo of her voice reciting lines never heard beyond her room. It is a curious thing to consider how a single house in a quiet New England town became the cradle of a poetic legacy that would one day stretch far beyond its walls. And yet for years, the world outside knew nothing of it. People passed by her window unaware that the woman inside was capturing the essence of life, death, hope, and despair with a precision and daring unmatched in her time. As we begin this journey, we are asked to slow our pace, to breathe more gently, to follow the cadence of a life measured not in grand events, but in moments of profound and sometimes unsettling stillness. By doing so, we come closer to understanding the silent landscape she inhabited. The unresolved sound that lingered in her room after her death now becomes the doorway into the next reflections. And as we stand in this quiet threshold, we prepare to step deeper into the past, toward the origins of the young girl who once played beneath the Amherst sun before shadows grew longer in her life. The candle that flickered on young Emily's childhood desk is where we must begin again, for that trembling light, fragile yet persistent, mirrors the earliest shape of her spirit. In Amherst, long before her seclusion became the quiet legend it is today, Emily was a child of uncommon sensitivity, moving between the brightness of the orchard and the deep inward corridors of her own thought with equal familiarity. Those who knew her in those early years often spoke of her as lively, even quick with laughter, yet there was a searching quality in her gaze, as if she were already listening for meanings hidden beneath the surface of ordinary moments. The Dickinson household, with its strict rhythms and the quiet authority of her father, fostered a kind of disciplined order, yet Emily found her own refuge within it, discovering early in life that silence could hold more truth than conversation. The world around her was one of clear seasons, each carrying its own lessons: the tremor of new blossoms in spring, the hum of bees near the barn, the crackle of autumn leaves underfoot, and the long, contemplative stillness of winter that thickened the air in ways she seemed to absorb instinctively. It was as though she recognized from childhood that life's most delicate truths lived not in declarations, but in moments barely noticed by others. And even then, she leaned toward them with natural reverence. The Dickinson family stood among the respected households of Amherst, anchored by tradition and expectation. Her father, stern but devoted, carried the weight of public duty, while her mother, often distant in manner though not devoid of affection, kept the household in steady motion. Within this environment, Emily and her siblings found their own forms of expression. Her brother Austin with his social brightness, her sister Lavinia with her lively pragmatism, and Emily with her growing affinity for inwardness. Early accounts recall her as an observant child, inclined to notice the smallest shifts in nature, the change of light across a wall, the way dust rose in the air when books were opened. These subtleties, which others might have overlooked, became the seeds of her later poetry, though no one at the time could have guessed it. Even her teachers, who recognized her intellect, could not fathom the depth of her introspection. They saw a bright mind eager to learn, but not the complex emotional terrain forming quietly beneath the surface, a terrain that would one day shape a body of work so rich in paradox, so alive with the tension between presence and absence, belonging and distance. There were moments in her youth when Emily seemed entirely a part of the social fabric around her. She attended gatherings, exchanged letters, formed friendships, and charmed those she met with her sharp wit and vivid mind. Yet even then, there was a sense of something held back, as if she existed at a slight remove from her surroundings, observing them with an almost ethereal detachment. This gentle separation was not yet isolation, but rather the earliest hint of her nature, a nature drawn to contemplation rather than display, to subtlety rather than explanation. Those who knew her well sensed this pull, but could not reach its source. It was not that she rejected society. Rather, she seemed to glide along its edge, choosing when to step in and when to retreat, guided by an inner compass few could interpret. Childhood memories placed her in the garden often, pausing to study a flower or a bird's sudden flight, with a depth of attention others rarely afforded. And though such scenes appeared simple, they revealed the early stirrings of a mind destined to seek meaning in the smallest gestures of the natural world. Her schooling played its part in shaping her, though not in the way education typically shapes young minds. Emily absorbed knowledge swiftly, yet she remained wary of ideas that demanded unquestioning acceptance. The revivalist religious fervor sweeping through New England at the time left many young students profoundly moved, but Emily held herself at a slight distance from it, contemplating faith with an independent and private rigor. She observed others experiencing sudden conversions, emotional upheavals, declarations of salvation, yet she felt no inner spark compelling her to follow the same path. Instead, she approached belief with quiet skepticism, as if sensing that truth, for her, would never arrive in the form of collective exaltation, but would instead emerge from subtle, solitary confrontation with the mysteries of existence. It is in these youthful hesitations, these careful refusals, that we see the earliest signs of the adult she would become, a woman who sought no approval for her thoughts, who trusted her own inward light, even when it deviated from the expectations of those around her. As she grew, Emily's relationship with her family deepened in ways both tender and complex. Her father's intellectual world fascinated her, yet his stern nature could be imposing. Her mother's calmness provided stability, though Emily often yearned for a closeness that seemed always slightly beyond reach. Lavinia became her companion in the most ordinary matters of the household, and Austin, with his own passionate inclinations, offered her a window into a world she observed but rarely entered fully. These relationships, threaded with affection and restraint, formed the early constellation of her emotional life. They shaped her understanding of closeness and distance, of what could be spoken and what must remain unspoken. The Dickinson home was full of love, yet the boundaries around that love were firm, creating a haven and a cage at once. It was within this intricate family landscape that Emily's sensibility sharpened, shaping the perceptiveness that would later render her poetry both haunting and precise. Around this time, the orchard became her sanctuary. Each season transformed it into a different world. Spring with its tender blossoms, summer with its hum of hidden life, autumn with its quiet surrender, winter with its bare, patient branches. Emily seemed to converse with these changes as though nature itself were a companion. It was here she first learned that silence could speak, that a tree, a shadow, a falling petal could hold more meaning than many conversations. She gathered metaphors from the air around her long before she ever set them to paper. These moments form the foundation of her inner landscape, the place she would carry with her even as she eventually withdrew into that single room where the majority of her poems were born. If one imagines her standing beneath the orchard's boughs as a young girl, gazing at the interplay of sun and leaf, it becomes clear that she was drawn not to isolation for its own sake, but to the quiet where hidden truths could rise to the surface. Yet even in these early years, one can sense a gentle tension building within her, as though two currents ran through her life, one pulling her toward the outer world with its gatherings and expectations, the other inviting her inward toward a deeper solitude. Which current would triumph was not yet evident, but the quiet pull of introspection grew stronger year by year, shaping her into someone who felt life most vividly not through participation, but through observation. Her brightness remained, yet it took on a reflective quality, like sunlight caught in glass rather than freely spilling across a room. The child, who once moved easily through Amherst, became increasingly attuned to the whispers of her own thoughts, finding in them a richness no social encounter could rival. As the candle on her desk continues to flicker in our memory, we sense that her path is already forming, though she herself may not be aware of it yet. A path toward inwardness, toward the quiet that would one day envelop her. And as the flame sways, casting shadows that stretch and then retreat across the wooden surface, we follow its trembling glow into the next stage of her life, where the first subtle turnings away from the world begin to take shape, silent and almost invisible, like the soft closing of a door. The letter she never sent still rests in our mind like a faint whisper, and it is from that unsent message that we step gently into the years when Emily, still young but no longer a child, began the slow and nearly invisible turning away from the world that would one day define her life. Nothing dramatic marked the shift, for she was never a woman of abrupt gestures or sharp proclamations. Her withdrawal was more like a change in the weather, noticed first as a passing coolness, then a quiet absence of expected warmth, and finally as a settled season of solitude that others sensed but could not name. In her late teens and early 20s, Emily moved through Amherst with a grace that appeared effortless, yet those who watched closely began to see that her presence grew softer, her step more hesitant, as though she were listening inward to a voice no one else could hear. The gatherings she once attended with a shy but genuine curiosity began to tire her. Conversations that once delighted her came to feel heavy. The world outside her home gradually grew too loud, too demanding, too full of expectations she did not wish to bear. It was not that she despised society, but rather that she seemed to feel life with such intensities that even small disruptions left lingering impressions she needed time to interpret before she could rejoin the world. And so, step by gentle step, she began to choose silence more often than speech, solitude more often than company. There were many reasons scholars would later propose for this shift, but the truth of such transformations rarely fits neatly into a single explanation. There are hints, though, in the fragments of her letters and the recollections of those who knew her. She experienced emotional tides that rose and fell more sharply than most, and she felt the sting of disappointment keenly. A friend departing, a mentor moving away, a series of small but meaningful separations. These events, while ordinary in the lives of many, carried a deeper weight for Emily. Each parting seemed to carve out a quiet hollow within her, a space she later filled with words rather than people. And though she continued to exchange letters with cherished friends, these correspondences increasingly became her primary connection to the outside world, a way of reaching out without fully stepping beyond the shelter of her inward realm. Through the delicate slanting of her handwriting and the careful arrangement of her thoughts, she could shape her emotions into something she could bear, something that did not overwhelm her as direct encounters sometimes did. There was also the question of her temperament, which leaned naturally toward introspection. She had long been drawn to the interior life, finding in her quiet reflections a richness that others might find only in bustling interactions. This inward pull was not yet the deep seclusion of her later years, but it was unmistakably present. Certain friends invited her to social gatherings, hoping to draw her back into the world, and at times she accepted with a gentle smile. But those who saw her there might notice that her gaze wandered to the corners of the room, or that her attention drifted toward a stray shadow cast by a lamp, as though external pleasures held less fascination for her than the images forming within her mind. Some mistook it for aloofness, but it was simply the nature of a soul who found her nourishment in contemplation rather than conversation. As she grew older, the contrast between her inner richness and outer quiet became more pronounced, and though she did not fully withdraw at this stage, the ground beneath her was already shifting. One particular turning point, though subtle, can be traced to her growing awareness of life's fragility. Illness, loss, and uncertainty touched Amherst in waves, and Emily, with her heightened sensitivity, absorbed these realities deeply. She saw friends depart, witnessed the frailty of those she loved, and felt in her own body the delicate balance between wellness and decline. While others might have turned outward for comfort, Emily turned inward, seeking in her reflections and her writing a way to steady herself against the unpredictability of the world. She began to approach life with a cautious reverence, as though each joy carried an echo of its own vanishing and each sorrow held a seed of revelation. This heightened awareness of impermanence did not drive her into despair, but it did deepen her need for the quiet where she could understand her emotions without intrusion. It was in these years that she began to sense, perhaps for the first time, the companionship of solitude, a companion who asked nothing of her but honesty. Still, she had not yet chosen the boundaries of her room as her final refuge. She continued to walk through Amherst, though her routes became more habitual and her encounters more selective. She visited neighbors, exchanged warm but brief pleasantries, and took part in household duties with dedication. Yet even in these ordinary tasks, one could sense her growing detachment from the outer world. The familiar paths she walked became less a connection to society and more a means of maintaining a delicate equilibrium between presence and withdrawal. As she moved through the town, she seemed to carry an invisible veil between herself and others, a veil woven from introspection, sensitivity, and the quiet ache of minor but accumulating disappointments. Those who passed her on the street might note her gentle smile but not see the depth of thought traveling behind her eyes, thought that was already beginning to shape itself into poetry she had not yet fully embraced. Romantic feelings may also have played a part in her turning away, though the details remain ambiguous, as most truths of the heart often are. She formed deep emotional bonds in these years, bonds that carried both joy and ache. Some of these affections were directed toward individuals who could not fully reciprocate, whether due to distance, circumstance, or the simple complexities of human nature. These experiences, while never publicly discussed by Emily, left traces in her letters and early poems, traces of longing, restraint, wonder, and quiet sorrow. Such emotions, for someone of her disposition, did not fade quickly. Instead, they settled into her like threads woven into the fabric of her inner world. It is possible that these unfulfilled connections strengthened her inclination to retreat, not out of weakness, but out of a desire to preserve the integrity of her feelings, to keep them from becoming diluted by the noise of daily life. Yet her withdrawal at this stage was still gentle, still reversible. The world had not lost her, and she had not fully abandoned it. She continued to participate in family life, to support household tasks, to care for those around her. Her laughter, while less frequent, was still heard. Her curiosity, though quieter, still stirred. Those who visited the Dickinson home could find her near the piano or reading by the window, her presence calm and attentive. But beneath this surface lay a subtle shift. Her attention had turned inward more often than outward, her emotional energy increasingly conserved for the private realm where she felt most herself. And though she offered affection to those she loved, she offered it carefully, as though guarding a delicate flame that could too easily be blown out by the winds of expectation or misunderstanding. As these subtle shifts accumulated, the world beyond her family home began to feel to her less like a place of engagement and more like a landscape she observed from just outside its boundaries. The gatherings she once attended became occasional rather than frequent. Letters replaced many visits. Short walks took the place of longer excursions. Silence enveloped her more often, not as an imposed state, but as a chosen environment. And yet she was not unhappy in this growing quiet. Rather, she seemed to find in it a sense of familiarity, perhaps even comfort. There is a distinctly tender moment one can imagine. Emily sitting by her window at dusk, watching the light fade across the Amherst fields, feeling within herself both the ache of separation and the solace of her own company. It is here, in these quiet evening hours, that her inner life deepened, forming the foundations of the poetry she would soon begin to write with a ferocity that belied her outward stillness. The letter she did not send, with its unspoken words and its quiet folding, remains a symbol of this period in her life. A small but potent gesture of turning inward, of accepting that some thoughts were meant for her alone. And as that unsent letter rests on her desk, its seal unbroken, we feel the moment stretch softly into the next chapter, where the gentle pull of solitude begins to grow stronger, drawing her step by step toward the life that would become her legend. The closed door behind which Emily stood at the end of our last reflection becomes the quiet threshold through which we now pass, entering the stage of her life when the early seeds of her withdrawal began to take root in ways more perceptible to those around her. The shift was not sudden, nor was it marked by any single event that could be pointed to as the catalyst. Rather, it was the accumulation of countless small impressions, each one a gentle tug, pulling her further inward. In these years, Emily moved with increasing delicacy between the world outside her home and the expanding realm within her thoughts. As Amherst bustled in its modest way with seasonal rhythms, local gatherings, and the ordinary commerce of a New England town, she found herself drifting quietly to the edges of its communal life, not with resentment or disdain, but with the instinctive hesitation of someone who felt more keenly than most the weight of social expectation. The friendly invitations, the church gatherings, the visits that once stirred her curiosity grew gradually more taxing. She began to excuse herself more often, her reasons always polite and sincere, yet vaguely threaded with a sense of gentle reluctance. It was as though each interaction drained from her a little more energy than it gave back, leaving her with the need to retreat into the silence where she could gather her strength again. In her home, the atmosphere was shifting as well, not dramatically, but with subtle changes that reflected her evolving rhythms. She began spending more time in specific rooms, particularly those that offered some measure of seclusion. Her family, accustomed to her thoughtful nature, did not at first find this unusual. The Dickinson household was one where duty, study, and contemplation coexisted comfortably. Edward Dickinson, her father, maintained a strict but steady routine, and her mother continued the quiet management of household affairs. Lavinia, energetic and pragmatic, often moved briskly through the rooms, tending to tasks with purpose. Emily fit into this household pattern while slowly reshaping her own place within it, carving out spaces of reflective stillness where she could withdraw when the outside world pressed too insistently upon her. These small sanctuaries became the early markers of her future seclusion, corners of safety where her thoughts could settle, like dust in a sunbeam, undisturbed and unobserved. There's a certain tenderness in imagining Emily in these early years of retreat, sitting near a window with a book open yet unread in her lap, her attention drifting to the shifting patterns of light on the floor. She seemed to absorb details others dismissed, noticing how a change in weather altered the tone of a room or how the sound of distant footsteps on the street carried with it the faint suggestion of stories she would never hear spoken. Her mind worked not along the lines of outward engagement, but inward resonance. She was not avoiding life so much as translating it into a language her spirit could understand, and this process required solitude. While many of her contemporaries found meaning in shared experiences and lively discourse, Emily increasingly found her sustenance in the quiet observation of life's subtler movements, the way a curtain lifted in the afternoon breeze, the brief flicker of a candle's flame, the sound of a page turning somewhere in the house. Each held a depth of implication for her that might seem inexplicable to a more socially driven soul. There is speculation that her gradual withdrawal was influenced by her heightened sensitivity, not only emotional but perhaps physical as well. She experienced periods of illness, fatigue, and discomfort that made participation in social life more challenging. These physical vulnerabilities, though not fully understood by those around her, contributed to her growing inclination to remain at home, where she could control her environment and retreat when necessary. Amherst, though small and familiar, still demanded a kind of public presence that she found increasingly burdensome. Her interactions with neighbors, once warm and engaged, became shorter, sometimes little more than a nod or a gentle greeting. And yet, even in these brief exchanges, she left impressions that lingered with others long after she stepped away. People remembered her eyes, bright and observant, and her voice, soft but clear, carrying hints of a mind that seemed always in conversation with unseen depths. Her family, too, began to notice her changing habits. While they accepted her inward nature, they could not fully grasp the extent of her growing retreat. She continued to assist with household duties, to offer affection in her own quiet way, and to share occasional moments of laughter or conversation. But there was a new distance in her gaze at times, a sense that part of her attention remained in a world beyond their reach. This was not a coldness. Emily was never cold. It was more a gentle drifting away, as though she were standing on a shoreline, watching the tide of her inner life begin to rise, carrying her a little farther from the familiar shores of daily interaction. Her father's stern devotion, her mother's reserved affection, Lavinia's lively practicality, all of these remained essential anchors in her life. Yet Emily increasingly seemed to navigate these relationships with a quiet caution, seeking to maintain balance without surrendering the growing need for inwardness emerging within her like a quiet dawn. It was during this period that she began writing more regularly, though still not with the intensity that would characterize her later years. Her earliest verses reveal a mind grappling with themes of nature, time, longing, and the delicate boundary between presence and absence. These early poems were like tentative steps into a landscape she sensed more vividly than she could yet articulate. They show an awareness of the world's beauty and fragility, an awareness sharpened by her tendency to observe rather than participate. Writing became a means for her to bridge the gap between her inner world and the outer one, to transform the impressions she gathered in silence into expressions of startling clarity and insight. Yet even here, her inclination toward privacy prevailed. She shared some of her early work with a few trusted individuals, but only sparingly, and often with disclaimers that belied the true depth of her creative power. Her poems were personal explorations, not public declarations. One can imagine her at her small desk, surrounded by the faint smell of ink and parchment, her thoughts flowing onto the page in short bursts of concentrated meaning. Her handwriting slanted and energetic, her punctuation unconventional, her lines distilled to their essential essence. These early signs of her distinctive style were emerging even as she continued to walk, however tentatively, among the ordinary rhythms of Amherst. But the more she wrote, the more she seemed to require the conditions that made writing possible: solitude, silence, and the freedom to follow her thoughts without interruption. The outside world, with its social obligations and unpredictable demands, grew increasingly incompatible with this inner necessity. And so, without grand decisions or public declarations, she allowed her life to bend gently toward the quiet she needed, a quiet that soon took shape around her like a cloak she wore with increasing ease. Her friends noticed the shift. Correspondences reveal their concern, their longing for her presence at gatherings she once attended. They missed her quick wit, her lively commentary, her unique perspective. Emily responded with warmth, always grateful, always affectionate, but often declining invitations with reasons framed in gentle, thoughtful language. These refusals were not driven by disdain, but by an honest recognition of her limitations and needs. She loved her friends, but she loved truth more deeply. And the truth was that her spirit thrived in solitude. Still, she maintained her connections through letters, which became her lifeline to the outside world. In these letters, she revealed more of herself than she ever allowed in person: her humor, her insight, her emotional depth. Yet even here, she held back certain parts of her soul, reserving them for her poems, where she felt free to speak without fear of misunderstanding. As this gradual turning inward continued, Amherst began to sense her absence in subtle ways. The girl who once walked its streets with quiet curiosity now appeared less frequently, and when she did, her visits were brief. Yet her presence remained a thread in the town's collective memory, woven through the stories of those who had known her in earlier years. Emily herself seemed to move through these memories like a figure, half in shadow, half in light, someone who had not disappeared but had begun a different journey, one that led inward rather than outward. And as we stand at this delicate moment in her life, feeling the air grow quieter around her, we sense that solitude is no longer simply a refuge, but a direction. The door she closes behind her now does not signal rejection, but a turning toward the interior landscape she is only beginning to explore. This quiet doorway leads us into the heart of her transformation, where the world outside gradually fades into a muted backdrop, and her room becomes the realm where her deepest truths will soon take shape. The unfinished line of verse resting on Emily's bed becomes the soft thread that guides us into the next chapter of her life, a chapter shaped by affections that glimmered quietly beneath the surface of her days, never fully spoken, never entirely extinguished. These were the years when love, longing, and the tender ache of unfulfilled connection began weaving themselves into her inner world, forming patterns that would echo through her poetry for decades to come. Yet nothing in Emily's emotional life unfolded with outward drama or public declaration. Her affections were private currents, running deep and steady beneath the calm waters of her outward composure. To those around her, she appeared serene, sometimes even reserved, but within her lived a world of intensity, woven from feeling so refined and so fiercely guarded that only her poems, and occasionally her letters, revealed its contours. Among those who stirred her inner life were figures she encountered through her family, her reading, and the intellectual circles that occasionally brushed against Amherst. She formed deep attachments to a few individuals, attachments marked by admiration, emotional resonance, and a kind of spiritual kinship that defied the conventions of ordinary friendship. The exact nature of these relationships remains shrouded in ambiguity. Scholars have proposed various interpretations, yet none can claim absolute certainty. Emily herself left only traces, never overt declarations, as though she believed that the essence of emotion lived not in naming, but in suggestion. Letters she wrote to certain confidants reveal flashes of unexpected tenderness, intensity, even yearning, but always intertwined with restraint. a restraint born not from fear, but from the understanding that some feelings could not survive the exposure of everyday language. Instead, she expressed them in metaphors, in moments of silence, in unfinished lines like the one left on her bed, where the words paused just before revealing too much. It is tempting to imagine her seated at her small writing table, pen poised over paper, shaping a letter to someone who had stirred her heart. The candle beside her flickers as she hesitates, searching for words that would neither reveal nor betray her deeper sentiments. She writes lines rich with affection, but before sealing the letter, she pauses, sensing that what she wishes to express cannot be conveyed without disturbing the delicate mystery she cherished. And so, the letter remains unsent, or perhaps it is sent, but with certain phrases softened, their original force disguised behind politeness. For Emily, love was never a simple path. It was a labyrinth of inner echoes, where each step forward carried with it the possibility of deeper vulnerability. She seemed to understand instinctively that some affections flourish only in silence, that naming them too plainly might diminish their truth or expose them to misunderstanding. Her heart moved in subtleties, in impressions rather than announcements, in quiet devotion rather than overt yearning. Yet these quiet affections shaped her profoundly. They awakened in her a heightened awareness of longing, not the loud, consuming longing of romantic drama, but a gentler, more contemplative yearning that seeped into her verse. In some of her poems, one finds the unmistakable presence of a beloved absent figure, someone who inspired both joy and sorrow, someone whose presence was felt even in their distance. There is an ache in those lines, an ache tempered by acceptance, as though she recognized that the boundary between closeness and separation was itself a space rich with meaning. She seemed to find in longing a form of clarity, a way of understanding the depths of her own emotions without needing to impose them upon another. This form of love, though unfulfilled in the traditional sense, nourished her artistic spirit, giving rise to some of the most poignant expressions in her work. There were also relationships marked not by romantic passion, but by intellectual kinship, connections that lit her mind with new ideas, new forms of inquiry, new ways of understanding faith, grief, nature, and the human soul. These relationships, often forged through letters, became vital threads in her emotional landscape. Certain individuals served as mentors or spiritual guides, offering her glimpses into worlds she could not easily enter herself. Their influence stirred in her a sense of connection that transcended ordinary acquaintance. Yet these bonds, too, were complicated by distance, circumstance, or unspoken boundaries. She respected these limitations, even as she felt the pang of separation. For someone as inwardly attuned as Emily, these bonds became both solace and challenge, sources of deep inspiration and equally deep longing. Within the Dickinson household, Emily's emotional world remained largely invisible. She expressed affection toward her family through small gestures, thoughtful acts, and occasional bursts of gentle humor. But the intensity of her inner life remained her own. Those she loved felt her warmth but could not fully glimpse the complexity beneath it. Her father's protective authority, her mother's practical reserve, Lavinia's lively companionship, all of these shaped her understanding of affection, yet none could entirely bridge the quiet space where her most private feelings lived. It was in that interior space that she contemplated the nature of connection itself, wondering perhaps why certain bonds deepened silently, while others drifted away without explanation. These reflections found their way into her poetry, emerging as lines that question the meaning of presence, the certainty of separation, the fragile balance between devotion and independence. There were moments when Emily stood at the cusp of greater emotional involvement, moments when a single word, a single gesture, might have deepened a relationship into something more concrete. Yet each time, she seemed to draw back slightly, not out of fear, but out of a reverence for the fragile intricacies of feeling. She sensed that to step forward too boldly might disrupt the delicate web of impression and possibility that sustained her inner world, and so she maintained her distance, choosing instead to allow affection to grow in the quiet spaces between letters, glances, and memories. This choice, though it carried its own sorrow, also granted her a profound freedom, the freedom to explore love as a landscape of nuance rather than a path of expectation. Her poetry from this period reflects this delicate balance. In her lines, one feels the presence of a beloved figure who remains unnamed, yet unmistakably important. There is a softness in these poems, a wistful tone that suggests both closeness and separation. She writes of meetings that shaped her, of partings that left echoes, of emotions that flicker like candlelight, warm, trembling, and deeply human. These poems do not reveal the specifics of her relationships. Instead, they offer glimpses into the emotional truth beneath them. They speak of a love that thrives in the imagination, a love that finds its deepest expression not in declarations, but in contemplation. It is this kind of love, ambiguous, intense, restrained, that would become one of the defining characteristics of her work. As her affections deepened inwardly, the outer world receded a little further. She remained capable of warmth and connection, but she increasingly needed solitude to process the complexities of her emotions. In the stillness of her room, she sifted through her feelings, translating them into lines of verse, fragments of thought, and letters that revealed only a fraction of what she felt. Her world grew quieter, yet richer. And though those around her may not have understood the depth of her emotional journey, the traces of it linger in the pages she left behind, offering us a window into the private kingdom of her heart. The unfinished line of verse on her bed now beckons us forward, its silence holding the weight of all she could not say aloud. As we lean close to that silent fragment, we follow its delicate pause into the next chapter of her life, where the image of the white dress she would one day wear becomes not only an emblem of her solitude, but a symbol of the fierce inner fire that continued to shape her evolving world. The gentle rustle of linen in the quiet hallway becomes our entry into this next reflection, for it is through that soft, persistent whisper of fabric that we approach the years when Emily's adoption of the white dress became both a daily ritual and a symbol that mystified those around her. The decision did not come with fanfare or explanation. She did not announce it, defend it, or interpret it for anyone. One day, she simply appeared in white, and then she continued to appear so, again and again, until the pale garment seemed almost an extension of her presence. People in Amherst whispered about it, not unkindly, but with the bewilderment small towns often reserve for behaviors that fall outside expected patterns. Yet Emily wore the dress with an ease that suggested it was not meant for spectacle or rebellion, but for comfort, perhaps even for clarity. She moved through her home and garden in that garment like a quiet flame, glowing softly, refusing to be extinguished, radiating a stillness that felt almost reverent. What the white dress meant to her is a question that has lingered long after her passing, a question scholars have explored with theories ranging from spiritual symbolism to personal preference, from aesthetic simplicity to emotional self-protection. Yet the truth, like much of Emily's inner life, resists neat conclusions. It is possible that she found in the whiteness a sense of purity, not purity in a moral sense, but the purity of a blank page, the openness of possibility. White holds all colors, yet reveals none unless touched by light. And perhaps she sensed in that neutrality a kind of refuge from the complexities of the world. The white dress might have offered her a simple, consistent form in a life filled with shifting emotional landscapes. Or perhaps she wore it for the same reason many artists adopt rituals. The repetition itself becomes a grounding force, a quiet assurance that the inner world can anchor itself through external constancy. Whatever her reasoning, the white dress was not a whim, but a mark of intention, a small window into the way she shaped her existence with subtle, personal meaning. The garment itself, plain and unadorned, seemed to mirror the qualities of her poetry, spare yet luminous, simple in form but layered with depth. Those who glimpsed her moving through the house described a figure who seemed almost translucent at times, as though she were both present and slightly distant, visible yet veiled. Emily did not seek to stand out, yet the white dress became a quiet beacon in her life, a soft but undeniable presence in every room she entered. Some might see it as a retreat from the world, but others might view it as an assertion of identity, a way of creating a personal boundary not through barriers, but through a consistent, unmistakable form. It allowed her to define herself on her own terms, to choose how she inhabited her daily life. In this sense, the white dress was not an act of defiance, but an act of self-possession. Her family grew accustomed to this choice with the same mixture of acceptance and gentle bewilderment that marked many aspects of her life. Lavinia, ever practical, may have wondered about the monotony of it, but she never pressed her sister for explanations. Her mother, accustomed to managing household routines, likely assisted in maintaining the garment's immaculate state. Her father, absorbed in public duties and the demands of law and community, may not have questioned it deeply at all, perhaps seeing it simply as part of Emily's temperament. For Emily, the white dress seemed to harmonize with the rhythms of her home. It became a quiet ritual that bridged her inner life with her outer existence. When she put it on each morning, she stepped into a kind of clarity that supported her creative impulses and her daily contemplations. It became a uniform for introspection, a garment that allowed her to slip into the quiet states of mind she needed to write with the intensity that was slowly taking root within her. In the garden, the image of her white dress among the dark leaves and trembling petals became something of a whispered metaphor among those who glimpsed her there. She moved through the orchard like a pale figure of thought itself, bending to examine a blossom, pausing to listen to the faintest shift of air. The dress gave her a sense of continuity, a way of merging with the landscapes she loved without losing her sense of distance from the world's demands. There is a gentle paradox in this image. The white dress made her more visible within the natural setting, yet it also gave her a kind of anonymity, as though she were blending not with the background, but with the very essence of what she observed. Her presence among the flowers and trees became part of a quiet ritual that shaped her creative vision, giving her the emotional space to transform the world's smallest gestures into something vast and resonant. Beyond its symbolic resonance, the white dress marked a shift in how Emily experienced her daily life. As her seclusion deepened, the garment became a constant companion, a soft shield between her and the unpredictability of the outside world. It offered simplicity where complexity threatened, calm where social intrusion weighed heavily. There were days when she may have stood at her window, feeling the sunlight pass through the fabric onto her skin, the whiteness reflecting light even as her thoughts dwelled in deeper shadows. On those days, perhaps, the dress served as a reminder that even in solitude, there could be brightness, a brightness she chose, a brightness she shaped. This garment, worn again and again, became a kind of silent affirmation that she could mold her own existence, even as the world around her unfolded with its own relentless expectations. And yet, the symbolism of the white dress also carried a hint of fire, a quiet rebellion smoldering beneath its calm surface. For in choosing to wear white daily and refusing the fashions and social norms of her time, Emily was asserting a subtle independence. She was choosing her own way of being, even in small matters, and doing so with a confidence that belied her reputation for shyness. The dress, for all its simplicity, was a mark of unconventionality. It suggested that Emily was not merely retreating from society, but redefining her relationship to it. She moved through her home with an ease that conveyed both detachment and purpose, as though she had found a way to align her inner vision with the outward expression of her identity. It was in these years, too, that her writing deepened in its complexity and force. The white dress accompanied her through countless moments of creative awakening, moments when she sat at her desk, lines forming in sharp bursts on small slips of paper, moments when she paced softly across her room, murmuring a phrase until it found its true shape, moments when the garden called her outside to observe a single insect or a shift in wind that would later become a metaphor she refined with quiet intensity. The dress, ever present, became the silent witness to these gestures of creation. It was there when she first began storing her poems in the small bundles now known as fascicles. It was there when she wrote lines that would one day astonish the world with their originality. It was there when she pulled back from social life more decisively, recognizing that her art demanded a solitude deeper than she had known before. People outside the Dickinson home could see only fragments of this transformation. They saw the white figure at the window, or the fleeting glimpse of her crossing the hallway, or the brief moment when she stepped outside to receive a visitor but did not linger. These glimpses became the seeds of rumor, the eccentricities of a woman becoming more elusive by the year. Yet within the home, within the mind that lived behind that white fabric, a fire was building, a creative intensity rising. The dress was not a symbol of fragility, but of the quiet power that comes from turning fully toward one's inner calling. And as the linen whispers again at the end of this reflection, as it moves gently with her breath or the movement of her hand, that rustle becomes our passage into the next part of her life, where her room begins to take on a new significance. Not merely a sanctuary, but the very kingdom where her imagination would soon reign with unmatched brilliance. The single sheet of paper turned face down on her desk becomes the threshold through which we now enter the part of Emily's life when her room transformed from a mere corner of the household into the quiet kingdom where her inner world flourished with a power that startled even those who sensed nothing of it at the time. This was not yet the complete seclusion that would come later, but it was the unmistakable beginning of her inward reign, an era when she discovered that the space around her, carefully shaped and defended, could nurture the kind of thought, observation, and creation that the outer world, with all its noise and demands, could never accommodate. The room was modest in appearance, small enough to feel intimate yet large enough to accommodate her wandering imagination. The light that entered through its window changed with the seasons, and Emily, with her acute sensitivity, seemed to draw meaning from each variation, as though the shifting brightness were a kind of language spoken only to her. To those outside the Dickinson home, the room was just another chamber in a respectable household. But to Emily, it was an entire landscape. Here stood the desk where she wrote many of her poems, its wooden surface worn smooth by her hands. Nearby, a small dresser held the folded white dresses she wore day after day, each one soft with frequent washing. The bed, neatly made but not overly adorned, offered a simple refuge, a place where she could lie awake at night and listen to the faint sounds of the house settling into sleep. In one corner, a basket might hold letters from friends and mentors, letters she treasured, reread, and occasionally responded to with bursts of poetic clarity. Every object in the room held a purpose, not necessarily practical but emotional, contributing to an atmosphere where Emily's thoughts could move freely, unencumbered by external intrusion. What made the room so essential to her was not merely its physical form, but the sense of protection it offered. Within these walls, she was at liberty to imagine without interruption, to allow her thoughts to gather into the unusual shapes that distinguish her poetry. The outside world, with its expectations, its conversations, its judgments, could not reach her here. And though her family might call to her from downstairs, she could decide when to respond, when to remain still, when to let silence answer in her place. This control over space, over time, over thought, was vital to her. It allowed her to preserve the delicate tension between solitude and observation that fueled her creative work, In the room, she became both witness and creator, attuned to the smallest details of the world, yet free to transform them into something entirely her own. The window of the room held particular significance, serving as the boundary between her chosen solitude and the ever-changing landscape outside. She often positioned herself near it, gazing out at the familiar view of Amherst, the trees bending in the wind, the distant figures passing along the road, the shifting clouds that shaped the quiet hours of afternoon. Through this window, she remained connected to the outer world without having to participate in it. The window let the world in, gently, filtered through glass and distance, allowing Emily to witness life without its overwhelming demands. It was here that she watched the seasons change, each one bringing its own palette of colors and sounds. Spring brought delicate blossoms, symbols of renewal that stirred her imagination. Summer arrived with heat and light, a season she often experienced in the cool shadow of her room. Autumn came with its soft rustling of leaves, a sound she cherished for its echo of impermanence. Winter, with its deep stillness, pressed close to the house, reminding her that silence itself could be a form of presence. Inside the room, the act of writing took on a ritualistic quality. Emily did not write in long, sweeping sessions, but in short, intense bursts. A line might come to her suddenly, sparked by a thought or image, and she would rise from her bed or chair to capture it on paper. Sometimes she wrote standing, as though the energy of her words demanded more than a seated posture could permit. The small slips of paper on which she wrote accumulated in drawers and boxes, forming the beginnings of what would later be discovered as her bound fascicles. Each fragment of verse was a piece of her interior world, shaped not by external instruction, but by the rhythms of her own breath, her own heartbeat, her own sense of truth. In this room, she allowed herself to experiment with language in ways that defied the norms of her time. She used dashes not as mere punctuation, but as markers of breath and thought, pauses that opened the poem to multiple interpretations. Her lines were short, not because she lacked words, but because she understood that meaning could be distilled into its purest essence with careful pruning. Her family, though aware of her increasing preference for solitude, rarely intruded upon her room without cause. They respected the boundaries she set, whether consciously or instinctively. Her father, though firm in temperament, understood that Emily needed her space. Her mother, whose health often fluctuated, leaned on her daughters for support, and Emily, despite her inwardness, was attentive to these needs. Lavinia, ever energetic, moved through the house with practical purpose, but never sought to break Emily's solitude. There was an unspoken understanding that the room was Emily's sanctuary, a place where she could withdraw without explanation. And though this withdrawal may have puzzled or concerned them at times, they accepted it as part of her nature, just as they accepted her devotion to her writing. To understand the significance of this room in Emily's life, one must consider how it contrasted with the expectations placed upon women in her era. While society encouraged domestic involvement, social visits, and participation in community life, Emily chose instead the inward journey, a form of independence that was quiet yet profound. Her decision to center her life around a single room might seem restrictive to some, but for her it was a liberation from the roles she did not wish to fill, from the obligations that exhausted her, from the noise that disrupted the clarity of her thought. In the room, she crafted her own identity, one not defined by societal expectations, but by the truth she discovered through introspection. The room also served as a repository for the emotional complexities she carried. When she suffered losses of friends, mentors, or cherished connections, she retreated to this space to process her grief. Here she allowed herself to feel deeply, to confront the sorrow that others might have encouraged her to set aside. Her poems from these periods reveal the rawness of her emotions, shaped into lines that speak of absence, longing, and resignation. But the room did not merely witness her grief, it also witnessed her moments of joy, her curiosity about the mysteries of existence, her sudden illuminations that transformed ordinary moments into profound insights. It was a space where she could hold all the contradictions of her nature without fear of judgment. The room grew into an extension of her mind, a place where thoughts could accumulate, shift, and crystallize. In its quiet, she felt free to explore questions of life and death, faith and doubt, presence and memory. The world outside might not have understood her choices, but the room did. It became the canvas on which she painted the landscapes of her inner world, a world far richer and more expansive than anyone, even those closest to her, could have imagined. As we stand in this room with her, watching the morning light slip across her desk and settle on the face-down sheet of paper, we sense that something is about to stir. The room has become her sanctuary, her realm, her creative haven, and as the light shifts, touching the edges of the page she left unfinished, we move with her into the next stage of her life, where the poems she crafted in this quiet kingdom begin to take on a daring, transformative force that challenges the boundaries of her era. The quiet dash lingering at the end of one of Emily's poems, an abrupt mark that opens rather than closes, becomes our passage into this next reflection, for it leads us to the period when her writing, shaped in solitude, rose into a quiet rebellion that challenged poetic convention itself. These were the years when her poems, short, intense, and breathlike, began to form a landscape unlike any other in American literature. And yet, while brilliance unfolded silently at her small desk, the world beyond her room remained unaware that a revolution in language was taking place within the walls of a single house in Amherst. To understand the magnitude of what she created, one must first feel the depth of the solitude that allowed such a voice to emerge. For her poems were not products of isolation alone, but of a solitude fiercely chosen, fiercely defended. They were the sparks of a mind that insisted on seeing the world not as it was taught to her, but as she felt it, a world refracted through the lens of her inner fire. Emily's poetry was unlike anything her contemporaries were writing. The era favored long, ornate verse, lofty metaphors, and predictable rhyme schemes, works designed to be read aloud, admired in parlors, and praised in literary circles. Emily, on the other hand, wrote in lines that felt as if they were cut from breath itself, short bursts of perception that captured not the embellishment of life, but its essential pulse. She used dashes not as mere punctuation, but as hinges, pauses that opened multiple meanings, allowed silence to speak, and gave rhythm to thought. Her slant rhymes, which seemed irregular or unfinished to the conventional ear, created a tension between harmony and dissonance that mirrored the very contradictions of existence she wrote about. These techniques were not stylistic experiments. They were expressions of her mind's natural cadence. In her poems, she sought truth not through clarity, but through suggestion and fracture, believing perhaps that the deepest truths live in the spaces where language breaks open. Her subjects, too, defied expectation. While many poets of her time wrote of love, nature, morality, and faith through the lens of tradition, Emily approached these themes as mysteries to be entered rather than solved. Death was not a distant concept, but a presence that walked beside her in thought, familiar and strange at once. Nature was not merely a backdrop or a symbol, but a living companion, a bee, a bird, a storm, that carried whispers of something eternal. Love was never a simple union, but a complex, shifting experience that hovered between presence and absence. Faith was not certitude, but questioning, the tension between longing for belief and confronting the silence of an indifferent universe. And through all of this ran a current of quiet rebellion, for she refused to accept the neat answers her culture offered, preferring instead to dwell in the unresolved, the half-spoken, the uncertain. This was a rebellion not of noise, but of insight. Her work grew rapidly in this period. She wrote hundreds of poems, often in quick succession, as though a gate had opened in her mind and words poured through faster than she could contain them. She captured her poems on scraps of paper, envelopes, the backs of letters, and then gathered them into small bundles she tied with string, fascicles that she hid in drawers, beneath her bed, inside small boxes. Each fascicle was both an archive of her creative spirit and a map of her inner landscape. The poems within them were carefully arranged, revealing thought patterns and emotional arcs known only to her. She shared a small number of these poems with trusted individuals, friends, mentors, someone who stirred her affection, but always cautiously. She approached the act of revealing her work as though she were exposing a part of her soul, something too delicate to risk misunderstanding. And indeed, some early readers did misunderstand, offering well-intentioned criticism that suggested she adhered to conventional forms. She considered such feedback, but ultimately, she refused to alter the voice that felt truest to her. The intensity with which she wrote during this time suggests that her solitude was not merely a withdrawal, but a crucible, a place where her mind could refine itself without distraction. She did not seek an audience. She sought honesty. And in that pursuit, she found a freedom that society rarely granted women of her era. Her room became a realm where she could test the boundaries of expression, question the structures of belief, confront the forces of life and death, and give shape to emotions too large for ordinary speech. Her poems were not diary entries, nor were they confessions. They were acts of perception, each one an attempt to capture a fleeting truth before it vanished. In this way, her work resembles not the polished compositions of her contemporaries, but the spontaneous sparks of an artist exploring the world from the inside out. Still, her writing did not occur in isolation from relationships. Even as she withdrew from the public sphere, her connections with certain individuals remained deep and influential. Her correspondence with mentors, figures who inspired her intellectually, kept her engaged with ideas and provided an outlet for her thoughts. These letters, infused with poetic language, served as extensions of her creative voice, offering glimpses into a mind both restless and luminous. Yet even in these exchanges, she maintained a careful boundary, revealing just enough to sustain the connection without surrendering the core of her inner world. It was this interplay, connection and distance, revelation and concealment, that fueled much of her poetry. She allowed emotions to ferment in the quiet shadows of her room, emerging in the distilled form of verse rather than in explicit confession. As her writing grew more daring, so did her inwardness. The world beyond her room became increasingly distant, not because she rejected it, but because her creative life demanded a depth of attention that social interaction could not accommodate. She moved through her home like a quiet current, present yet apart, listening to the house's rhythms, noticing the shift of light on the floorboards, the sound of birds gathering outside the window, the faint murmur of conversations downstairs. Every sound, every flicker, every moment fed her imagination. The room became an instrument, its stillness, its intimacy, its boundaries, shaping the tone and cadence of her work. And while those around her accepted her inwardness with varying degrees of concern and understanding, few realized that within that small space, she was reshaping the very possibilities of American poetry. This phase of her life, though outwardly uneventful, was one of tremendous inner movement. The poems she wrote during these years carry traces of longing, loss, wonder, fear, and awe, emotions she experienced in the privacy of her thoughts. Sometimes she wrote with an urgency that suggests she was racing against time, as though she felt life's brevity pressing upon her. Other times she wrote with quiet contemplation, capturing moments so small they might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. A bee's erratic flight, a petal falling from a flower, a grain of dust turning in sunlight, each became a doorway into larger questions. Her mind, sharpened by solitude, saw significance where others saw simplicity. In these poems, one senses her awareness of her own strangeness, her recognition that she was moving along a path few would understand. Yet she did not resist this path. She embraced it with a fierce honesty. She did not write to be accepted or admired. She wrote because the act of writing was as essential to her as breath, a means of sustaining her existence. And perhaps she sensed that her room, the sanctuary she had shaped so carefully, was the only place where she could live this truth without compromise. As we linger in this moment, as the soft whisper of a dash draws us deeper into the silence she cultivated, we feel the weight of her creative transformation. The poems she crafted in this period were quiet rebellions, small acts of defiance against the constraints of form, tradition, and even time itself. And as we step from this reflection into the next, the echo of her pen yet lingers in the air, carrying us toward the growing storm of isolation that would soon envelop her life more completely, even as her poetic fire continued to burn with increasing brilliance. The distant toll of the Amherst church bell, lingering at the end of our last reflection like a solemn reminder of time, slipping quietly onward, becomes the doorway through which we enter the period when Emily's isolation deepened into something more than habit, into a way of being that defined her daily life. By now, her withdrawal was no longer the gentle drift of earlier years, but a gradual enclosing, a settling into a realm where the inner world grew larger as the outer world receded. To the townspeople, she became a figure glimpsed only occasionally, a pale form at a window or a fleeting presence on the doorstep. To her family, she was both near and far, always within the house, yet not always accessible, her reserved distances forming a rhythm they eventually learned to respect. And to herself, the solitude was neither a prison nor an escape, but a natural atmosphere, the air she had learned to breathe without strain. Her refusal to travel, once a mild preference, became almost absolute. Opportunities arose: family trips, social invitations, journeys to distant friends. But each one she declined with a quiet firmness. She had no desire to leave Amherst, nor even her home. The thought of long roads, unfamiliar rooms, or bustling gatherings unsettled her in ways she seldom articulated. Her world depended on the constancy of her surroundings, the familiar creak of the stairs, the steady shape of her room, the quality of light through the window she knew so well. She had roots in the soil of her home that were not easily disturbed, roots that extended not only into the physical place, but into the patterns of thought she nurtured there. The world beyond felt too loud, too chaotic, too insistent. And perhaps, too, she sensed that leaving the safety of her chosen terrain might interrupt the flow of her creativity, which had become central to her existence. Visitors to the Dickinson house began to notice the changes as well. When callers arrived, Emily sometimes retreated to another room, listening from a distance, while Lavinia or her parents welcomed the guests. At other times, she would greet the visitor briefly but remain at the top of the stairs, her presence fleeting, her voice soft, her manner polite but quick to withdraw. A few individuals, trusted friends or figures of intellectual resonance, were granted longer exchanges, but even these encounters grew rarer. It was not a rejection of affection, but a need to protect her inwardness, to preserve the emotional clarity she had cultivated with such care. Her letters remained her primary bridge to the world, letters that carried her wit, her warmth, her curiosity, and the unmistakable touch of her poetic mind. Yet even in these correspondences, there was a quiet distancing, a tendency to keep certain subjects veiled, certain depths unspoken. Her family adapted to her inward turn with a mixture of curiosity, patience, and acceptance. Edward Dickinson, though stern and pragmatic, respected his daughter's wishes, perhaps sensing that her solitude had become inseparable from her well-being. Her mother, often unwell and withdrawn in her own way, may have understood Emily's retreat more intuitively than others realized. Lavinia, practical and lively, continued to play the role of guardian to the household's external affairs, often shielding Emily from unnecessary intrusions. There were moments of tension, to be sure, times when Emily's refusals or silences puzzled or frustrated those who loved her. But the family, rooted in long familiarity, learned to navigate around her choices. They allowed her the space she needed, even when they did not fully understand why she needed it. In these years, the rhythms of her days became increasingly structured around introspection. She rose early, often before the household stirred, using the quiet hours of morning to write. She moved softly through the rooms, attending to small tasks, tending to her plants, or sitting by the window in contemplation. Meals were often taken in her room or at odd hours, depending on her mood or the state of her thoughts. She continued to bake, particularly her famed gingerbread and bread rolls, which she sent down to visitors or neighbors as tokens of affection. These small gestures of domesticity carried a quiet intimacy, a way of touching the world without stepping fully into it. Yet her solitude was not a void, it was filled with the intensity of her inner life. The poems she wrote in this period reflect a deepening engagement with themes of mortality, longing, and the enigmatic boundary between life and death. She did not fear these subjects. She approached them with a kind of reverent curiosity, as though conversing with the mysteries that dwell at the edges of human experience. The presence of death in her work was not morbid, but contemplative, a recognition of its inevitability and its strange intimacy with life. She wrote of funerals passing by her house, of the quiet processions that wound through the streets of Amherst, of the tolling of bells that signaled another departure. And yet, even as she observed these rituals from a distance, she transformed them into meditations that transcended the events themselves. Her isolation sharpened her sensitivity to the smallest details: the sound of a carriage rolling by, the creak of the front gate, the murmur of conversation drifting up the staircase. These sounds became part of her inner landscape, echoes that shaped her understanding of presence and absence. She listened to the world without being fully in it, and in doing so, she cultivated a form of perception that few others could attain. The quiet of her room did not dull her senses, it heightened them. She felt deeply the stirrings of nature outside her window, the slant of sunlight across the floor, the shift of seasons. Each sensation became a doorway into reflection, a spark that could ignite a poem. Her withdrawal also changed the way Amherst regarded her. Once known as a bright, social girl with sharp wit and lively curiosity, she gradually became perceived as eccentric, enigmatic, even ghost-like in her elusiveness. People spoke of her with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment, unsure whether to view her seclusion as a mystery to be solved or simply an oddity to be tolerated. Children whispered stories of the woman who lived upstairs and seldom ventured out. Adults speculated about her health, her state of mind, her reasons for retreating from the world. Yet these whispers never reached her room in any meaningful way. She insulated herself from them with the same quiet determination that shaped her poetry. And still, her writing flourished. The poems from this phase reveal a mind wrestling not only with existential themes, but with the nuances of emotional experience: loneliness, desire, disappointment, resilience. She wrote of being both part of the world and apart from it, of feeling deeply connected to life yet unable to participate in it fully. Her lines captured the paradoxes of solitude, the beauty that grows from it, and the ache that sometimes accompanies it. But she did not seek to solve these contradictions. She simply inhabited them, letting her poems carry the weight of what could not be neatly resolved. One has to imagine Emily in the late afternoon, the light thinning around her, the sound of distant church bells marking the hour. She sits at her desk, pen in hand, shaping another poem, brief, enigmatic, precise. Outside, life continues in its steady rhythms: horses passing, neighbors speaking, children playing. Inside, her world expands, her voice deepens, her thoughts move along the contours of silence, And as she sets her pen down, listening to the last echo of the bell, we sense that her isolation, far from diminishing her, has become the very soil in which her genius takes root. The tolling of the bell fades now, but its echo leads us into the next part of her life, where illness, sorrow, and inner turbulence rise like a shadow at dusk, subtle at first, then unmistakable, shaping the poems she would write and the person she would become. The quill paused mid-stroke on her desk becomes our dim lantern as we enter the years when illness, sorrow, and the unspoken tremors of Emily's inner world began to gather around her like a slowly tightening mist. It is important to understand that these shadows did not arrive with sudden violence. They crept in gently, almost tenderly, the way twilight spreads across a landscape, soft at first, then deepening until shapes blur and distances disappear. By the time Emily reached her middle years, she was already acquainted with frailty of body and heaviness of spirit. Her health, never entirely robust, began to impose itself upon her days with a quiet insistence. There were periods when she could not descend the stairs without effort, moments when dizziness halted her steps, and evenings when her breath came thin and fluttering, as though frightened by its own persistence. Yet she seldom complained. To those around her, she presented a composed exterior, moving carefully through her routines, accommodating her limitations with grace. But the signs were there, unmistakable to anyone who knew how to look. The pauses that lasted a little too long, the afternoons spent lying still in her room, the letters that hinted at exhaustion she never fully named. Her illnesses, whatever their true nature, did not simply weaken her body. They sharpened her awareness of life's fragile boundaries. The quiet hours spent resting became hours of contemplation, hours in which she confronted questions many avoid until forced. She looked upon mortality not with dread, but with a strange familiarity, as though it were a guest who visited from time to time, sitting at the foot of her bed, waiting for her to acknowledge it. These contemplations seeped into her poetry. She wrote of death with a clarity that startled, not as a final severing, but as a transformation, a passage, a lifting of the veil. Her descriptions of eternity grew more vivid, more curious, more daring. She imagined the soul leaving the body the way a bird leaves its nest, hesitating only for a breath before taking flight. She considered heaven not as a distant realm, but as a possibility just beyond perception. Her poems from this period reflect an intimacy with the unseen, an acceptance of mystery that felt neither fearful nor resigned, but quietly attentive. Alongside her physical frailty, another kind of turbulence stirred within her, the emotional tremors left by losses that accumulated over the years. Death came often to Amherst in the 19th century. Friends were taken suddenly by fever, consumption, accidents, and unrelenting illnesses. Mentors who had once inspired her moved away or passed from the world entirely, leaving behind letters she reread with trembling care. Each departure carved a hollow in her heart, a hollow she filled with reflection rather than complaint. Emily felt loss in a way that reached far deeper than convention allowed. She did not forget those she loved after the customary mourning period. She carried them within her for life. Their absence became part of her daily landscape, a silent presence in her room, a shadow lingering near her writing desk. In her poems, she returned again and again to the theme of separation. Not only physical separation, but spiritual and emotional distance, the kind that stretches across time and memory. It was during this era of her life that she wrote some of her most piercing lines about pain, though she rarely addressed it directly. Instead, she wrote around it, through metaphor, through suggestion, through images of winter frost thinning into spring or the dimness that follows a bright flash of lightning. Pain, for her, was not something to describe plainly. It was something to translate. She approached it with a kind of reverence, as though acknowledging that suffering, too, held meaning concealed within its harshness. And yet, for all this depth, she protected her vulnerabilities fiercely. She seldom allowed even her closest correspondents to glimpse the fullness of her inner storm. In her letters, she would hint at fatigue, sorrow, or uncertainty, but never linger on them. There was always a quick turn toward brightness, a metaphor that lifted the tone, a question that deflected attention away from herself. It was as though she believed that to expose certain feelings too plainly would diminish them, or worse, might burden those she cared for. Her family witnessed more than she shared in words. There were days when she moved through the house with slow steps, her hand brushing the wall for balance. There were nights when she sat awake, the candle burning low as she stared at a page she could not bring herself to write upon. Her mother's declining health added to her emotional weight, demanding care and attention that Emily gave willingly but not without strain. Edward Dickinson, her father, whose firm presence had shaped much of her early life, grew older as well, and the responsibilities of the household pressed increasingly upon the sisters. The Dickinson home became a place filled with the quiet tension of illness and duty, a space where the boundaries between caregiving and sorrow blurred. Emily bore these pressures with quiet endurance, yet each difficulty added to the invisible burden she carried. Despite these struggles, or perhaps because of them, her writing entered a phase of remarkable intensity. Illness sharpened her focus, loss deepened her sensitivity, and isolation expanded the range of her contemplation. She wrote with a fervor that seemed almost urgent, as though she sensed time gathering around her in a tightening circle. Her poems from this period often carry the rhythm of a racing heartbeat, compressed, breathless, startling in their insight. She explored the boundaries of language, pushing form to its edges. She allowed her lines to break where others would smooth them, allowed meaning to fracture where others would mend it. It is in these fractured lines that one feels her emotional turbulence most clearly. Her dashes lengthen, her pauses deepen, her metaphors grow bolder. These were not the experiments of an ambitious writer seeking admiration. They were the expressions of a soul grappling with questions too immense for conventional form. During these years, Emily's correspondence with certain individuals became both solace and challenge. Some of her most emotionally charged letters were written during this time. Letters filled with longing, admiration, cryptic affection, or a trembling vulnerability she seldom allowed into speech. These correspondences, complex, shifting, sometimes painful, stirred her deeply. At times, they lifted her spirits and expanded her sense of connection. At other times, they disappointed or confused her, leaving her to retreat again into her solitude to make sense of the disappointment. The oscillation between closeness and distance, between anticipation and restraint, infused her poetry with a tension that feels palpable even now. Love, for Emily, was never a steady experience. It was a flicker, a possibility, a wound, a revelation, a silence. And in her most turbulent moments, she found that the act of writing, of shaping feeling into language, offered the closest thing to relief she could claim. There were days when her illness pressed so heavily upon her that she could do little more than lie in bed and watch the light move across the room. During these times, her thoughts took on a dreamlike quality, drifting between clarity and haze. The boundary between waking and imagining blurred. Some of her poems from this era carry the marks of this blurred state, lines that shift suddenly from the concrete to the surreal, images that seem suspended between life and dream. She inhabited those thresholds with ease, for they mirrored the thresholds she sensed within herself, between health and sickness, between presence and absence, between despair and the strange beauty that sometimes follows it. And yet, through all of this, her spirit remained unbroken. There was a quiet resilience in her, a refusal to succumb to darkness even when it surrounded her. She continued to find awe in the smallest gestures of the world, The way a beam of sunlight struck a particular corner of the wall, the sound of sparrows gathering near her window, the crisp coolness of early morning air. These sensations, small though they were, sustained her. They reminded her that life, even when circumscribed by illness and sorrow, still held moments of wonder. And because she felt these so deeply, she continued to write, sometimes with trembling hand, sometimes with breathless urgency, but always with the belief that capturing these moments mattered. The quill she laid down at the end of these reflections rests now, its ink drying slowly, the last line of her poem still trembling with unresolved thought. And as we follow the faint trail of that ink into the next part of her life, we move toward the enigmatic figures who stepped briefly into her world. Visitors whose presence left subtle footprints on her spirit, footprints that shaped her solitude in ways both tender and mysterious. The fading trail of footsteps on the Dickinson stairs becomes our bridge into this next reflection, leading us toward the enigmatic figures who stepped, however briefly, into Emily's quiet realm. These visitors entered her life in ways that were subtle yet significant, stirring the still air of her solitude with currents of thought, affection, and longing that she rarely permitted herself to express openly. They were not numerous. Emily did not allow many into the intimate sphere of her inner world. But those few who did cross her threshold, sometimes literally, sometimes only through letters that traveled uncertain distances, left impressions upon her spirit that reverberated long after their physical presence faded. Their visits, whether brief or extended, were events of great inward magnitude for someone who lived mostly within the confines of her room, someone whose emotional landscape had become both her sanctuary and her shadow. Among these figures were mentors, correspondents, and companions whose intellect or temperament resonated with hers. Some arrived unexpectedly, drawn to the Dickinson household by social custom or professional duty. Others were invited through correspondence long before they set foot in Amherst, forming a connection that slowly built anticipation. For Emily, such visits were not mere social exchanges. They were moments of profound encounter, times when her inward life brushed against the outer world in ways that exhilarated and unsettled her. The presence of another person, especially someone whose mind she admired, could ignite a flurry of emotion within her, from admiration to anxiety, from warmth to a sudden impulse to retreat. Yet these encounters, though often brief, left traces in her letters and poems, revealing the depth of feeling they stirred. One such visitor was a minister she greatly admired, whose sermons had moved her in ways she could scarcely articulate. When he visited the Dickinson home, Emily found herself both drawn to and held back from him, her admiration charged with an intensity she struggled to manage. His presence filled the house with a quiet seriousness, and Emily observed him with the kind of attentive wonder she reserved for figures who sparked her imagination. Their conversations, when they occurred, were measured and thoughtful. But beneath the surface, Emily felt the tremor of a connection that remained partly unspoken. She later wrote letters to him filled with tenderness, reverence, and a longing for understanding, letters that hovered between spiritual contemplation and emotional confession. These exchanges, though limited, left a deep impression on her, shaping her reflections on faith, love, and the intimate bond between souls who meet only briefly, yet profoundly. Another visitor, a woman of remarkable intellect and sensitivity, brought a different kind of resonance to Emily's life. Their bond formed slowly, nurtured first through letters that carried warmth and admiration across distances. When this friend visited Amherst, her presence illuminated Emily's world with a rare sense of recognition. Emily felt that she had found in her a kindred spirit, someone who understood the inner landscapes that others might struggle to perceive. Their time together, short walks, shared conversations, quiet afternoons in the parlor, left Emily's thoughts stirred long after the visit ended. In her poetry, one finds echoes of this companionship, lines that speak of joyful recognition, of the bittersweet ache of parting, of the longing for sustained connection. The friendship did not unfold without complication. Distance, responsibility, and the inevitable shifts of life shaped and strained it. Yet it remained one of the most dear to Emily's heart, a reminder that even in solitude, she could feel the warmth of genuine regard. There were also those who visited not in person but through letters, intellectual companions whose words reached her room like faint yet persistent knocks at the door. These correspondents, though separated from her by miles, became part of her interior world. Their letters carried news of distant places, reflections on literature and faith, and expressions of affection that Emily received with cautious gratitude. She responded with her characteristic mix of intensity and restraint, offering glimpses of her thoughts while maintaining the boundaries she needed to feel safe. Some of these correspondences grew into relationships of considerable significance, shaping her understanding of love and connection in ways that were both fulfilling and painful. Others faded slowly, leaving behind a quiet sense of disappointment that found its way, transmuted, into her poetry. What makes these visitors and correspondents so important to Emily's story is not the specifics of their identities, but the emotional and intellectual space they occupied within her life. Solitude did not harden her heart. Rather, it heightened her sensitivity, making every connection more potent, every departure more piercing. When someone entered her life, whether through a brief visit or a long exchange of letters, Emily responded with an attentiveness that magnified the experience. She felt the presence of another soul with a depth that others might reserve only for the most intense relationships. This depth, while profoundly enriching, also brought vulnerability. For each visitor who stirred her spirit, there came the inevitable moment of parting, a moment Emily internalized with a poignant mixture of gratitude and sorrow. The house would feel quieter after such visits, the rooms holding a faint afterimage of the guest's presence. Emily, returning to her solitude, would feel the ache of the absence before she transformed it into thought and verse. In these transitions between connection and separation, presence and memory, her poetry flourished. Many of her most intimate lines carry the imprint of these encounters. She wrote of souls meeting and parting, of the sharp sweetness of recognizing a kindred spirit, of the boundaries that keep individuals apart even when affection is strong. Her metaphors for these themes are striking. Two stars that shine brightly yet remain distant, two rivers that run parallel without touching, two hands reaching across a veil. These images convey both the beauty and the ache of connection for someone who lived at the threshold of isolation. Her family observed these shifts with interest but did not always grasp their significance. They saw the letters arriving, the occasional visitor welcomed into the parlor, the way Emily's mood sometimes lifted or sank depending on the correspondence she received. But they could not see the internal storms or illuminations these relationships stirred within her. Emily did not speak of such matters openly. She guarded the emotional truths of her life with the same care she gave her poems, knowing that their delicacy required protection. Her room became the sanctuary where she processed these encounters, where she allowed herself to feel deeply before shaping the emotions into lines of verse. There is an image worth holding here. Emily standing just out of sight as a visitor descends the stairs, listening to the fading sound of each step. She places her hand lightly on the banister, feeling the vibration of the house as the door below opens and closes. The silence that follows is not empty. It is full, dense with meaning. In that silence, Emily feels both the warmth of connection and the inevitable sorrow of its ending. She turns back to her room, where the quiet waits for her, where her papers lie scattered in gentle disarray. And as she steps inside, closing the door behind her, the air seems to settle around her anew, ready to receive the thoughts that were stirred by the presence of another. The footsteps fade completely now, leaving us in the hush that always follows a departure. And from that hush, we move into the next part of her life, where the whispers of Amherst, its rumors, misunderstandings, and quiet speculations, begin to shape the town's perception of her, revealing the subtle scandals and shadowed truths that formed around her growing seclusion. The half-closed curtain at the end of our last reflection becomes the narrow slit through which we now peer into the murmuring world beyond Emily's sanctuary. For it is here, caught between light and shadow, that we encounter the quiet scandals and whispered speculations that drifted through Amherst as her seclusion grew more pronounced. These whispers did not carry the sharp edge of malice. They were softer, almost puzzled, born from the gentle confusion of a small community trying to comprehend a life that no longer followed recognizable patterns. Yet even the quietest murmurs can take on a life of their own, especially in a town where daily rhythms slow in winter, where familiar streets invite repeated glances toward particular windows, where unusual behavior, however benign, stirs curiosity simply because it breaks the expected flow of ordinary days. And so the figure of Emily Dickinson, seen less and less often beyond the walls of her home, glimpsed only occasionally in white near a doorway or fleetingly in the garden, became the center of stories woven from distance rather than understanding. Amherst, though dignified and hard-working, was still a place where news traveled quickly, slowed only by the pace of horse hooves on packed dirt. People noticed things. The absence of Emily at gatherings where once she had appeared, however briefly, the way she seemed to watch the world from behind the protection of a cracked door, the fact that visitors spoke with her parents or siblings but seldom with her. These observations accumulated into quiet conversations exchanged over fences, in the pews after services, at the counter of the general store. No single whisper held much weight, but together they formed a kind of collective curiosity, an unspoken question hovering in the air. Why had Emily Dickinson chosen such a life of withdrawal? Some speculated she was ill, too frail to venture into the world. Others believed her heart had been wounded by some private disappointment, leaving her unable to bear the complexities of social life. A few, sensing the unusual cadence of her mind, suggested she was simply too strange, too intense, too filled with inward fire to manage the ordinary demands of society. These murmurs, half-formed and passed between neighbors with a mix of concern and fascination, shaped an evolving image of Emily that bore little resemblance to the truth she lived. For while her solitude was real, it was not rooted in scandal in the conventional sense. Yet because her retreat defied explanation, the town created its own narratives shaped less by malice than by the human tendency to fill silence with conjecture. Among the more persistent whispers was the idea that Emily's white dress signaled some deeper meaning, perhaps a vow, perhaps a heartbreak. Some wondered if she had lost a great love or refused a proposal, choosing instead to dedicate herself to some private devotion. Others hinted at eccentricity, suggesting she dressed in white as a sign of emotional imbalance or undue sentiment. These interpretations, though imaginative, reveal more about the limitations of Amherst's perspective than about Emily herself. The town understood the world through shared patterns, through visible customs and familiar roles. A woman who stepped outside those roles, by choice rather than circumstance, stood out not because she sought attention, but because her life flowed counter to the predictable currents of community life. There were also subtler scandals, if one can call them that. Quiet questions about why Emily seldom attended church, why she did not participate in the social duties expected of women of her standing, why she wrote so many letters yet rarely allowed herself to be seen. In a community that valued visibility as a sign of belonging, her preference for invisibility created a tension that people resolved through speculation. Her absence from congregational gatherings, in particular, drew notice. Amherst was a town where faith was woven into daily life, where attendance at sermons was both a spiritual and social act. Emily's decision to remain apart from these rituals sparked gentle bafflement. Some believe she wrestled with unspoken doubts. Others suspected a deeper, more private form of belief at odds with public expression. Her correspondence, filled with metaphors of faith and doubt, suggests that her spiritual life was rich, complex, and continually evolving, far too nuanced to be confined to communal rituals. It is worth pausing here to consider the nature of scandal in a place like Amherst. Scandal did not arrive in the form of outward transgression or dramatic missteps. Instead, it surfaced in small deviations from expectation, in quiet choices that unsettled the comfortable rhythms of communal life. Emily's refusal to conform to these rhythms, though entirely benign, created the impression of secrecy. And secrecy, even when it guards only solitude, invites speculation. People wondered what she wrote in her room, why she kept her poems hidden, why her letters were so cryptic, why she seemed to move within her home like a figure out of some myth whispered only at twilight. Her privacy became a canvas onto which others projected their own interpretations, crafting stories that filled the gaps left by her silence. Some of these stories softened with time. Certain neighbors admired her devotion to her family, her keen intellect, her quiet generosity. They remembered the baked goods she sent downstairs to guests, the flowers she tended in the garden, the gentle notes she left for those who needed comfort. Others saw her as a kind of mystery, someone whose inwardness hinted at depths they could not reach. A child passing the Dickinson house might look up at the windows and imagine the woman inside as a spirit or enchantress, a figure both present and elusive. These impressions, though partly fictional, reveal the aura that grew around her as her reclusion deepened. Her own family, living in closer orbit to her daily life, sometimes found themselves unintentionally contributing to the town's misconceptions simply because they respected Emily's desire for privacy. They seldom offered explanations for her choices, perhaps believing, as she did, that no explanation was necessary. And so the vacuum of information remained, filled instead by whispers that drifted through the town like leaves carried by a shifting breeze. Yet what makes this period particularly compelling is not the nature of the rumors themselves, but Emily's response to them. She did not respond at all. She neither corrected nor indulged the speculation. She simply continued her inward journey, allowing the world to draw whatever conclusions it wished. She seemed to understand that misunderstanding was an inevitable consequence of living differently, and she accepted it without bitterness. In her poems, one occasionally senses an awareness of how others perceived her, a wry nod to their misconceptions, a gentle irony in describing what it means to be reverse to the world. But she never allowed these perceptions to alter the course she had chosen. In the quiet sanctuary of her room, the half-closed curtain shielding her from the eyes of Amherst, she continued to craft poems that far surpassed the town's limited imaginings of her. Her solitude, though misunderstood, became the crucible of her genius. Every whisper outside her window was balanced by the blazing clarity of her thought within. And as the curtain sways slightly in the afternoon breeze, half revealing, half concealing, we move toward the long middle years of her reclusion, the years when seasons turned and the world outside changed. Yet her room remained the still center from which she observed everything with a gaze as piercing as it was unseen. The distant carriage passing by her gate felt more than heard in the quiet air of the Dickinson home, becomes the gentle momentum that leads us into the long middle years of Emily's reclusion, a period defined less by dramatic events than by the slow, rhythmic deepening of her inward life. It was during these years that her existence settled into a pattern so subtle, so consistent, that each day seemed both entirely new in its inner richness and nearly indistinguishable in its outer form. To many, such sameness might have bred monotony, but for Emily, it became a sanctuary, an ordered, familiar space in which her imagination could move freely, unburdened by disruptions from the outside world. In these years, she wrote with a steadiness that bordered on the elemental, lived with a quiet devotion to ritual and reflection, and allowed the passing of seasons to become both her calendar and her companion. The house in Amherst grew increasingly self-contained. The Dickinson family, already close-knit, lived in a kind of shared solitude as illness, aging, and the shifting tides of fate drew them inward. Emily's mother's declining health required attentive care, a task that fell largely to Emily and her sister Lavinia. Though Emily seldom left the house, she did not merely languish within it. She moved through its rooms with purpose, tending to her responsibilities with a gentle diligence that belied the exaggerated myths of total withdrawal that later generations would craft around her. She baked bread, oversaw small household matters, and cared for her mother with the same quiet attentiveness she brought to her poems. Yet even as she performed these tasks, she preserved within herself a profound interior distance, a sense of existing at the boundary between duty and contemplation. Outside her window, the seasons turned with their steady, unhurried logic. Spring brought the soft unfurling of blossoms that she watched from her room or tended to during brief, cherished excursions into the garden. Summer's light deepened the colors of the orchard, filling the air with hums, scents, and shifting shadows that fed her poetic eye. Autumn, perhaps the season most aligned with her temperament, painted the landscape with tones of transience, golden leaves falling softly, cooling winds sweeping across the garden paths, the earth preparing itself for rest. Winter stilled the world entirely, muting sounds and pressing close to the house with its blankets of snow and long, contemplative nights. Each season spoke to her in its own language, offering metaphors, questions, and moments of quiet revelation. She observed them with an intensity that transformed ordinary cycles of nature into intimate companions. Her writing, during these middle years of reclusion, became both a daily devotion and a form of private reckoning. She wrote not simply to express, but to discover, using words to explore the contours of her inner life. Her poems grew more daring in form, more enigmatic in meaning, more distilled in their emotional force. She continued to compile her fascicles, binding together poems with string or thread, creating small volumes that she stored carefully in drawers and boxes. Each fascicle was an archive of a particular period of her inner journey, a constellation of thoughts, images, and emotional states, arranged with a precision only she fully understood. She wrote quickly, instinctively, often revising only through the rhythm of her breath rather than through conventional rules of grammar or structure. Her poetry became the purest reflection of her solitude, a language crafted for no audience but herself, though she shared select works with correspondents when stirred by a spark of connection or curiosity. The Dickinson household became the vessel of her world, and within it she created a life rich in unseen nuance. Certain routines took on the shape of ritual. She wrote in the early morning light, prepared small meals with care, tended to her plants, and sometimes sat in quiet shadow as her mother slept nearby. She made sure that her father's papers were in order, that Lavinia's burdens were shared, that the household ran with a kind of understated harmony. Yet despite these active roles, she remained shielded from external demands. She rarely greeted visitors, choosing instead to send down notes or baked goods as tokens of regard. Those who came to the Dickinson home might hear her voice through a closed door or catch a faint glimpse of her white dress in the hallway, but they seldom saw her fully. This added to the mystique that enveloped her, an image of a woman simultaneously present and unseen. In these middle years, time began to change its meaning for Emily. The steady rhythms of the household and the seasons offered a structure, but within that structure, time stretched and softened in ways that defied ordinary measure. Days blurred into one another, distinguished not by external events, but by the shifting moods of thought and creativity. She lived almost entirely in moments, in the flare of insight, the quiet pause between thoughts, the faint stir of emotion that led her to reach for pen and paper. This way of living made her intimately familiar with the nuances of perception, allowing her to hear the faintest tremors of experience that others might overlook. Her poems from this era reveal an extraordinary sensitivity to what lies beneath ordinary appearances, the breath of a moment, the shadow of a feeling, the glint of eternity glimpsed in the smallest gesture. Yet for all the richness of her inner world, these years were not without strain. Caring for her mother placed emotional and physical demands on her that she bore with quiet strength. Her father's expectations, though often softened as he aged, still cast a subtle pressure upon the household. Lavinia, while devoted, had her own wants, needs, and frustrations. Emily absorbed these tensions with a calm that belied their impact. There were days when the weight of responsibility pressed upon her, days when fatigue or sadness crept into her solitude, days when grief over past losses resurfaced with renewed sharpness. She experienced periods of melancholy, or what we might today call depression, though she seldom named such feelings directly. Instead, she translated them into images: frost on a window pane, a darkening sky, the hush that precedes a storm. Her correspondence during this time reflects the balance she sought to maintain between connection and distance. She wrote to friends with affection, offering comfort, wit, and the subtle warmth that those who knew her treasured. But she also guarded her inner life carefully, revealing only fragments of her struggles. Her letters often carried a buoyancy that masked the depth of her introspection, and her friends, charmed by her unique voice, could not always discern the complexity beneath her playful metaphors. She never fully abandoned the world beyond her home. She simply interacted with it through the scaled-down lens of writing, selecting only those moments of connection that nourished rather than drained her. There is an image from these years that lingers poignantly. Emily standing at her window, watching as a carriage approaches the house. She remains still, her hand resting lightly on the curtain. She listens as the wheels slow, as voices murmur below, as the door opens to welcome the visitor. She does not descend the stairs, but she listens closely, absorbing the tone of the conversation, the cadence of laughter, the subtle shifts in mood. Her imagination fills in the details she cannot see. To many, such distance would feel like exclusion, but to Emily, it became a vantage point, a way to engage with others while preserving the sanctuary that creativity required. The carriage eventually rolls away from the gate, carrying with it the voices and impressions of the outer world. And as its sound fades down the Amherst road, its echo leads us gently into the next stage of Emily's life, where the focus shifts inward once more, not upon the rhythms of her days, but upon the quiet, astonishing discovery of the locked drawer that held the collected fragments of her soul. The soft thud of the closing drawer, felt more than heard in the stillness of Emily's room, becomes the quiet gateway into the next chapter of her life, the chapter shaped by the locked drawer that guarded her poems like a silent sentinel. For many years, this drawer held the growing archive of her creative spirit. Hundreds of small folded slips of paper, bound with thread, gathered into hand-stitched packets known now as fascicles. Within these fragile bundles lay not only the poems themselves, but the very map of her inner world, its questions, its illuminations, its tremors, its quiet rebellions. Emily did not speak openly of these poems, nor did she display them with pride or anticipation of recognition. Instead, she hid them away with the same deliberate care she brought to their creation, as though each piece of writing were a secret too alive, too delicate, to endure the gaze of the outside world. The locked drawer and the tiny bundles within it became a part of the daily landscape of her room. There were days when she approached it with the air of someone consulting a trusted confidant, opening it briefly to place a newly written poem inside or to adjust the arrangement of the existing ones. Then there were long stretches when the drawer remained untouched, its contents resting in darkness while Emily went about her routine. The very existence of the drawer symbolized the duality of her inner life. On the one hand, a deep and unstoppable creative force. On the other, an equally powerful desire for privacy, control, and inwardness. It was a sanctuary within a sanctuary, a private realm tucked inside the larger sanctuary of her room. When she opened it, she stepped into a universe of her own making, one that no one else entered during her lifetime. Why she chose secrecy remains a subject of enduring speculation. Some suggest she feared criticism, that she worried her unconventional style, its sparse lines, its fractured punctuation, its startling metaphors, would be dismissed or misunderstood. Others believe she simply valued the purity of creation more than the demands of public judgment, that she wrote for herself alone and felt no need to share her work beyond a few trusted correspondents. There are those who argue that she was waiting for a moment that never came, a moment when her confidence in her own voice would finally align with a willingness to let it be heard. And perhaps all of these interpretations contain a fragment of truth, for Emily was too complex, too inward to be contained by a single explanation. What is clear is that the locked drawer was not a sign of indifference or lack of ambition. Rather, it was the embodiment of her belief that her writing needed space to breathe, to grow, to become itself before the outside world could lay its claims upon it. Within the drawer, the fascicles accumulated with almost startling speed during her most creative years. She stitched them together with thread, arranging them in sequences whose logic only she understood. Each fascicle contained poems written in bursts of inspiration, grouped perhaps by theme, by emotional resonance, or by the intuitive rhythm of her thoughts. Scholars would later pore over these bundles, marveling at the intricacy of her arrangement, the precision with which she placed one poem beside another. To Emily, the fascicles were not merely storage, they were a form of composition, a way of shaping the architecture of her work, even before she imagined it might one day be read by others. The act of sewing them together was itself an act of devotion, a ritual that reflected the care she gave to her inner world. It is telling that she seldom spoke of publication. When she did, it was with reluctance, hesitancy, or gentle humor. A few of her poems were published during her lifetime, but these appeared only because well-meaning friends insisted, and even then, the published versions were altered by editors who corrected her punctuation, smoothed her slant rhymes, and reshaped her lines into the forms expected by 19th century poetry. The result left her dissatisfied, confirming perhaps her suspicion that the literary world was not ready to hear her voice in its true, unaltered form, and so she retreated more fiercely into her private realm, choosing the locked drawer over the printed page, the quiet of her room over the noise of public opinion. By withholding her work, she preserved its integrity. She allowed it to remain hers. Yet it would be a mistake to imagine that secrecy meant isolation from emotional experience. On the contrary, Emily's poems reveal a mind profoundly engaged with the world, its joys, its sorrows, its terrifying mysteries. She wrote of love with an intensity that belies the myth of her as a cold recluse. She wrote of grief with a clarity that suggests she felt it in every part of her being. She wrote of hope, despair, nature, faith, and the small moments of daily existence with an awareness that seems almost prophetic. These poems, locked away, unseen by the world, were the distillation of her most intimate reflections. Each bundle in the drawer held a universe, and she visited that universe as often as she dared. Her family, living alongside her, sensed only fragments of this creative life. Lavinia knew her sister wrote, of course. She sometimes saw Emily carrying slips of paper or sewing the fascicles late at night, but she did not grasp the magnitude of what Emily created. Their mother, often confined to her own slow decline, may have glimpsed here and there the evidence of Emily's writing without full understanding. Edward Dickinson, deeply invested in the practical matters of law and property, likely saw only the surface of Emily's quiet routines. None of them suspected that upstairs, in that modest room, she was crafting one of the most extraordinary bodies of work in American literature. The poems were her private companions, and she allowed them to remain so. The locked drawer also became a symbol of the cost of secrecy. While it protected her work, it also reflected the boundaries she maintained between herself and others. Those who loved her, friends, correspondents, even family, never fully glimpsed the entirety of her inner world. She shared fragments, yes, but never the whole. Her solitude deepened not only because of circumstance or temperament, but because she guarded her emotions with the same care she guarded her poems. This guardedness created a kind of loneliness, though she seldom acknowledged it directly. Her poems speak of longing, sometimes fervent, sometimes resigned, a longing for connection, for understanding, for a companionship that did not threaten her inwardness. It is easy to imagine her standing beside the locked drawer in moments of reflection, her hand resting gently on the wood, feeling the weight of all that remained unshared. As the years passed, the drawer grew heavier, not in weight, but in significance. It became the silent witness to her evolving thought, her shifting emotional landscapes, her approach toward the profound truths she sought to articulate. And in the evenings when the house settled into its familiar creaks and sighs, Emily would sometimes open the drawer and take out a fascicle, running her fingers lightly over the stitched edge before reading the poems within. In these quiet rituals, she reaffirmed a sense of identity that no one else fully understood. Now, as we feel the drawer close again, with its soft thud echoing into the stillness of her room, we follow that sound into the next stage of her life, a stage marked by profound personal loss, where death entered not as an abstract idea or poetic metaphor, but as a series of painful departures that carved deep shadows across her solitude. The black ribbon set aside at the end of our last reflection becomes the quiet emblem through which we enter the years when loss moved through Emily's world with a solemn persistence, shaping her inner life in ways that only deepened the solitude she had long embraced. Grief, for her, was not a sudden tempest, but a slow-moving tide, an ache that gathered weight and meaning each time it returned. The 19th century was no stranger to death, and Amherst, like many New England towns, lived with the constant cadence of passing bells, somber processions, and shuttered windows. Yet for Emily, loss did not become habit or numbness. It became a profound landscape, one she navigated with a sensitivity and intensity that few around her could comprehend. Each death, whether of family, friend, mentor, or cherished correspondent, left an imprint that she carried quietly within her, transforming grief into insight, sorrow into poetry, absence into a haunting presence that shaped the very rhythm of her days. The first great losses in her life arrived early, but it was in her middle years that death seemed to circle closer, touching those she relied upon most intimately. Her mother's long decline was a sorrow that unfolded over years, a gradual unspooling of vitality that required patience, tenderness, and a kind of emotional endurance that Emily provided without hesitation. Though her mother had never been a fully intimate companion, there was love in the distance between them, a steady thread of devotion woven through years of mutual dependence. As her mother's health waned, Emily spent more of her days attending to her needs, becoming both caretaker and silent witness to the slow ebb of a life she had known since childhood. These experiences, though grounded in the routines of care, stirred in her a deeper awareness of fragility. She saw, day after day, how the body weakens while the soul still flickers within, how presence can fade long before departure. Her poems from this period reflect this paradox, lines filled with the tension between the physical erosion of life and the enduring mystery of spirit. The loss of her father was another event whose interior impact far exceeded the outward expression. Edward Dickinson had been a formidable presence, a man of duty, order, and unwavering principle. His sternness had shaped the household. His expectations had shaped Emily's early sense of self. Though he did not always understand her inwardness, he respected her intellect and provided the stability that allowed her solitude to flourish. When he died suddenly, the shock reverberated through the house like a bell struck too hard. Emily felt the impact deeply, though she expressed it, as always, with restraint. In her poems, one finds echoes of that loss, images of broken bonds, of moments suspended in grief, of the strange stillness that follows the departure of someone who seemed immovable. She experienced, with his passing, an unsettling shift in the foundation of her world. The house she had lived in all her life became at once more fragile and more sacred, a place marked by the absence of the figure who had anchored it. But perhaps the most deeply felt losses were those of her close friends and companions, some distant in geography, others distant in time but intimately alive in her heart. The departure of a beloved mentor, a correspondent whose words had stirred her imagination and shaped her reflections on faith and emotion, struck with a force that left her searching for meaning in the quiet hours of her room. She mourned not only the person but the conversations, the unspoken understandings, the intellectual companionship that could no longer be renewed. Letters became reliquaries, memories became small altars. She revisited in thought. Each loss intensified her introspection, prompting her to question the nature of connection, the persistence of the soul, and the possibility that love, once formed, never fully dissolves, even when its earthly ties are severed. The death of her young nephew, a child she adored with fierce tenderness, tore open a deeper wound. His bright presence in the Dickinson household had brought rare moments of laughter and lightness into the rooms she often inhabited alone. His illness and passing were devastations she felt with a grief so raw that her poems from this period tremble with the weight of it. She wrote of heartbreak, not as a dramatic cry, but as a quiet fracture, a splitting of the world into before and after. The loss of a child carries a different hue. Its sorrow glows with innocence disrupted, potential undone. This loss marked her profoundly, deepening her understanding of the fragile boundary between life and eternity. Her grief did not consume her, but it changed the way she looked upon the world outside her window. Colors shifted, silences lengthened. The passing of seasons carried with them a quiet ache, a reminder that time offers no guarantees of continuity. In these years, mourning became not an isolated event, but a recurring presence. She wore black ribbons not just for one loss, but for many, each ribbon a small, dignified acknowledgement of sorrow, too intimate for public lament. And though she seldom spoke of her grief openly, those ribbons carried a language all their own. They marked her as someone who lived with absence, someone who carried memory with reverence, someone who understood that love often reveals its deepest truths only in its loss. Yet even as grief shaped her, it did not harden her spirit. Instead, it made her more attuned to the delicacy of existence, more aware of the invisible threads that connect lives across time and distance. Her poetry absorbed this awareness with quiet intensity. She wrote of death not as an end, but as a companion, a presence that lingered at the threshold of her thoughts. She approached mortality with curiosity rather than fear, exploring its dimensions with the careful attention she gave to all mysteries of the human experience. In her lines, one can feel her leaning toward the unknown, listening for its faint whisper. Even when sorrow pressed heavily upon her, she found ways to distill it into insight, an image of a fading light, a metaphor of transformation, a question left delicately unanswered. Grief, for her, was not something to overcome. It was something to explore, something that revealed truths obscured by the brightness of ordinary life. Yet the weight of these losses, carried quietly over the years, did contribute to the deepening of her seclusion. Each departure made the world beyond her room feel a little more distant, a little less inviting. Connections frayed not because she withdrew from them, but because life, in its unrelenting movement, pulled others away through circumstance, distance, or death. Her circle of intimacy narrowed naturally, leaving her with a small constellation of beloved figures whose presence she cherished all the more intensely. This contraction of her world did not diminish her inner expansiveness. If anything, it sharpened it. She poured into her writing the emotions she did not share aloud, crafting poems that held within them the distilled essence of her experiences. The drawer filled with fascicles became not only the archive of her creativity, but also the repository of her grief. And yet, even in these years marked by sorrow, there were moments of unexpected lightness. Emily was not a figure of unbroken gloom. She laughed. She found joy in small wonders. She delighted in wit, in nature, in the company of those she loved. These moments did not erase grief, but they coexisted with it, creating a complex tapestry of feeling that her poems capture with striking nuance. She lived with sorrow, but she also lived with wonder. She carried loss, but she also carried love. The black ribbon lies now where she set it, a symbol of the many shadowed chapters she endured with quiet dignity. And as we turn from this image, we move into the next stage of her life, where the years themselves begin to narrow, and Emily, already so accustomed to solitude, steps gently toward the final period of her earthly journey, a period marked by increasing frailty, deepened inwardness, and the gradual fading of her physical presence, even as her inner light continued to burn with undiminished clarity. The dimming light in her window becomes the quiet threshold through which we enter the final years of Emily's earthly life, a period marked not by dramatic rupture, but by a slow, nearly imperceptible fading, like the gradual thinning of twilight before night settles fully upon a landscape. These were the years when the vitality that once pulsed discreetly beneath her solitude began to ebb, when her steps grew shorter, her breathing more delicate, her world more tightly bound to the narrow orbit of her room and the rooms adjoining it. Yet even as her physical strength waned, her inward flame continued to burn with a clarity that astonished those who glimpsed it in the final poems and letters she composed. There was no surrender in her decline, no bitterness or despair, but rather an increasing refinement of the qualities that had shaped her life: introspection, tenderness, curiosity about the unseen, and a quiet devotion to the mysteries that had occupied her since youth. In these final years, the Dickinson home became a realm almost completely sealed from the outer world. Her withdrawal, once partial and selective, became nearly absolute. The front door remained closed to visitors who once might have been welcomed, and even familiar friends found their interactions limited to brief exchanges through ajar doors or notes passed down the stairs. Emily conserved her strength for those she loved most deeply, particularly her sister Lavinia, who remained her closest companion and caretaker. Their bond, already strong, deepened even further during this time. Lavinia moved through the house with brisk, purposeful energy, tending to her mother, managing household affairs, and ensuring that Emily's needs were met without fuss or intrusion. Though they were so different in temperament, Vinny practical and outward-looking, Emily inward and contemplative, their relationship had a natural ease that required no explanation. They understood one another in a way that transcended words. Emily's mother, whose long decline had shaped much of Emily's middle years, eventually passed, leaving behind a silence that felt different from all previous silences. Her mother's presence, even when muted by illness, had been a constant companion. Her absence created a new stillness in the house, one that Emily absorbed with her characteristic quietness. Though she seldom expressed grief outwardly, the loss carved yet another hollow space within her, adding to the constellation of absences that had gradually reshaped her emotional world. She and Lavinia, now alone in the house, except for occasional visitors and household help, formed a kind of two-person world, each sustaining the other in ways that felt both ordinary and profound. Emily's own health grew increasingly fragile. There were periods when she experienced severe headaches, dizziness, or spells of weakness that left her unable to descend the stairs. Her heart, too, showed signs of strain, beating sometimes too fast, sometimes too faintly, as though uncertain of its capacity to keep pace with her still vivid mind. Her friends who received letters during these years noticed subtle shifts in her tone, a brevity that suggested fatigue, a softness that hinted at physical strain, a deepening inwardness that revealed both serenity and vulnerability. And yet, even in these states of weakness, she never relinquished her curiosity about the mysteries that had long preoccupied her. She continued to ponder the nature of eternity, the thin veil between life and death, the strange ways in which love persists beyond physical presence. Her final poems carry within them the distilled essence of these contemplations, short, luminous fragments that read like whispered conversations with the infinite. The seasons continued their cycles outside her window, though Emily experienced them now as a spectator rather than a participant. In spring, she might sit by the open window, listening to the tentative sounds of new life, the first calls of birds returning from migration, the whisper of leaves unfurling, the murmurs of distant footsteps along the Amherst road. In summer, the orchard shimmered with heat, and she would feel the warm breeze drifting through the room, carrying with it the scent of ripening fruit and distant hayfields. Autumn brought its tapestry of golds and reds, a season she had always loved for its quiet acceptance of endings. Winter pressed its cold hands against the house, deepening the solitude that already defined her life. Each season spoke to her differently, yet all seemed to echo the same question she had followed since youth. What lies on the other side of what we can see? Her room, which had served as sanctuary, workshop, observatory, and confessional, became in these years almost an extension of her own body. She moved within it with the familiarity of someone who knew every shift of light, every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind at the window pane. The room had grown quiet with her, holding her breaths, her pauses, her moments of stillness. The drawer that guarded her fascicles remained closed more often now, not because she had ceased writing entirely, but because her energy came in brief sparks rather than steady flames. She still reached for pen and paper when the moment demanded it, capturing thoughts that rose with sudden urgency. Those who loved her watched her decline with concern, softened by acceptance. They knew she had always lived at the threshold between presence and absence, that her body was merely the vessel for a mind and spirit that seemed, even at their strongest, to dwell partly in another realm. Her death, when it came, did not arrive as a sudden shock, but as a gentle slipping away, a quiet conclusion to the inward journey she had been traveling for decades. She passed surrounded by the familiar walls of her room, the window through which she had watched so many seasons, the drawer filled with poems she had hidden from the world, and the sister who had stood beside her through every turning of her inward life. After her passing, a stillness fell upon the house, deeper than any that had come before. To those who entered her room, the air felt charged with something unspoken, as though her presence lingered in the space between objects, in the shadows near the window, in the faint scent of ink and pressed flowers. Her bed remained neatly made, her desk lightly dusted, her manuscripts tucked away exactly as she had left them. It was a silence not of emptiness, but of transition, a silence that seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. For what came next was extraordinary. In the days following her death, when the house settled into its solemn rhythms, it was Lavinia who discovered the hidden treasure Emily had left behind. She opened the locked drawer and found, to her astonishment, nearly 2,000 poems, bound in fascicles, tied with thread, or folded loosely between the pages of books. The sheer volume of the work was staggering. What they revealed was even more so, a body of poetry unlike anything the literary world had yet encountered, a voice so original and daring that it seemed to have come from some distant corner of human experience. Yet in this moment, before the poems would be published, misunderstood, altered, or celebrated, the discovery existed in a kind of suspended wonder. The room, still dim with the fading light of her presence, now held the fullness of her genius, finally visible to others. And as that dimming light lingers at the threshold of our vision, we move into the next part of her story, where her death gives way to revelation and her hidden legacy begins its long journey into the world. The manuscripts spread like fallen leaves across her bed, become the first trembling breath of revelation as we enter the stage of Emily's story, when the hidden voice she guarded so fiercely in life finally stepped quietly into the light after her passing. It was Lavinia who stood at the heart of this moment, her hands trembling slightly as she lifted the small bundles of folded paper tied with thread, bundles she had seen her sister handle with such deliberate care, yet had never fully understood. Emily had left no clear instructions beyond a simple request that her letters be burned, but the poems, the hundreds upon hundreds of fascicles and loose sheets, lay unclaimed by any explicit directive. Their very existence in such careful order, their quiet accumulation over years, offered a silent argument against destruction. And Lavinia, who had lived alongside Emily's solitude, who had respected her inwardness without ever grasping its full dimensions, found herself holding the greatest question of her sister's legacy in her hands. The scene itself carried an atmosphere of tender astonishment. Emily's room, which had long been the private universe of her inner life, now opened itself to the eyes of others, though only by necessity and only in this moment of discovery. The bed where she had rested and written, the desk where her quill had paused so often, the window through which she watched the slow rotation of seasons, all of these familiar objects remained exactly as she had left them. The soft morning light filtered into the room, touching the edges of the papers as though acknowledging their significance. The air was still, too still, as if the house itself understood that a profound unveiling was taking place. Lavinia, sorting through the drawer that had kept Emily's poems hidden, uncovered layer after layer of her sister's inner world. She lifted the fascicles one by one, careful not to disturb the fragile threads binding them. Some were neatly arranged, containing dozens of poems stitched together in a sequence that suggested intention. Others were folded loosely, marked with faint pencil edits or pressed against the covers of books Emily had read. As Lavinia unfolded them, she glimpsed the slanted handwriting she knew so well, yet now it carried a weight she had never fully comprehended. She read lines that shimmered with the strange clarity of Emily's thought, lines that seemed to speak directly to her, yet also to something beyond her reach. It is easy to imagine the mixture of awe and sorrow that must have overcome her. Sorrow for the sister she had lost, awe for the brilliance that had lived beside her all these years, hidden behind the quiet rhythms of domestic life. Emily had spoken of her poetry only sparingly, offering hints of her devotion but never revealing its scope. Lavinia had known that Emily wrote, of course. She'd seen her retreat to her room with paper in hand, had noticed the frequent visits to her drawer, had observed the way her eyes seemed to glow with an inward flame after certain moments of reflection. But she had never imagined this vast archive, this sweeping landscape of language, thought, and emotional depth. To discover it now was like discovering that the sister she loved had lived a second life that had unfolded silently beside the visible one. With each fascicle Lavinia opened, she felt the burden of responsibility settling upon her. Emily had left no instructions to publish, yet she had also made no move to destroy the poems. The orderliness of the fascicles, the careful stitching, the deliberate arrangement, they all suggested that Emily had prepared them for preservation, if not for sharing. Lavinia sensed that her sister's work, so profound and so carefully crafted, could not remain in darkness. And so, with the same decisiveness she had shown throughout her life, she resolved to bring Emily's poems into the world. The task was far from simple. The poems' unconventional punctuation, their spare forms, their slant rhymes and sudden breaks, presented challenges to editors unaccustomed to such originality. When Lavinia sought help from family friends familiar with writing and publishing, she encountered reactions that ranged from admiration to bewilderment. Some recognized immediately that Emily's work was extraordinary, unlike anything they had seen. Others believed it needed smoothing, adjustments to bring it into alignment with traditional standards of poetry. And Lavinia, though determined to see her sister's voice shared, was herself not a writer or critic. She had to rely on others to shepherd the work into publication, trusting that their intentions, if not always their decisions, would honor Emily's genius. The process of preparing the poems for print involved sorting, copying, deciphering, and interpreting. Editors faced a daunting task. Emily's handwriting, though familiar, was often compact and slanted, with dashes that defied conventional grammar, with capitalization that seemed to follow the rhythms of thought rather than rules. There were variations among poems, alternate word choices noted in the margins, and occasional unfinished lines. Some editors interpreted these variations as errors or drafts, not recognizing them as integral to Emily's artistic process. Thus began the long, complicated journey of bringing her work to the public, one marked by both reverence and compromise. When the first collection of her poems was published, the world was not fully prepared for the voice it encountered. The edited versions, smoothed into conventional patterns, retained the brilliance of her imagery, but lost some of the radical energy that pulsed through the original manuscripts. The dashes were shortened or removed, the capitalization normalized, some of the slant rhymes corrected into traditional pairings. These changes, made with the belief that they would make the poems more accessible, had the unintended effect of dimming some of the poem's raw power. Yet even in this altered form, her work was unmistakably extraordinary. Readers sensed immediately that they were encountering a mind of uncommon depth, a voice that approached life, death, nature, and love with a perspective so singular that it felt almost prophetic. The initial reception was mixed, as is often the case with pioneering work. Some critics admired her originality, praising the intensity of her insight and the haunting beauty of her imagery. Others dismissed her deviations from convention, puzzled by the brevity of her lines, the ambiguity of her metaphors, the sudden shifts in perspective. Yet the seeds of her legacy had been planted. Over the decades that followed, scholars, poets, and ordinary readers alike returned to her poems again and again, peeling back the layers of meaning, marveling at the precision of her language, grappling with the mysteries embedded in her lines. What is most remarkable about this period of discovery is not simply that the world gained access to Emily's poetry, but that the revelation of her work reshaped the understanding of who she was. The woman Amherst had regarded as a reclusive figure, eccentric and quiet, emerged as a visionary whose inner life had been far vaster than anyone imagined. The poems revealed a mind alive with tension, awe, sorrow, courage, and fierce introspection. They exposed the breadth of her emotional world, the existential reach of her questioning, the subtlety of her spiritual reflections. The myths that had begun forming around her lifetime solitude were complicated, enriched, and challenged by the work she left behind. Yet even in this unveiling, the essence of her remains elusive. The poems themselves, with their open-ended questions and deliberate ambiguities, resist any final interpretation. They invite readers in, yet always hold something in reserve, just as Emily herself did in life. The manuscripts spread across her bed were not simply relics of her solitude. They were the living heartbeat of her voice, preserved entirely on her own terms until the moment fate placed them in Lavinia's hands. Now, as we stand at this delicate threshold between secrecy and revelation, the rustle of those manuscripts becomes our guide into the next part of her story, the part in which her work begins its complicated journey into the world, reshaped by editors, received with curiosity, and gradually recognized as one of the most haunting and transformative contributions to American literature. The image of a poem stripped of its delicate dashes, lying quietly on an editor's desk, becomes the faint doorway through which we enter the next movement of Emily's unfolding legacy, an era when the world, encountering her voice for the first time, did so through a softened echo rather than the true cadence she had shaped in solitude. For although Emily had preserved her poems with meticulous intention, the literary climate of her era was not prepared to receive work so unconventional, so boldly compressed, so deeply attuned to the pauses and fractures of thought. Those who first handled her manuscripts believed they were doing her kindness by smoothing her idiosyncrasies, straightening slant rhymes, standardizing capital letters, reducing or removing the enigmatic dashes that served as breath, break, and boundary all at once. They did not recognize these marks as essential to her voice. They saw them instead as eccentricities of an otherwise extraordinary poet. And so the poems entered the world transformed, still luminous but carrying only a fraction of the intricacy that Emily's original hands had woven into them. Yet even in this altered form, her work stirred immediate wonder. Readers who opened the first published collection, Poems by Emily Dickinson, released in 1890, found themselves confronted with a voice unlike anything they had encountered before. Her poems were short but startling, restrained in length yet expansive in implication. The everyday objects of her New England world, bees, birds, flowers, seasons, shadows, became vessels for existential contemplation. The vast terrain of human emotion was condensed into lines as sharp and fleeting as lightning. She wrote of death with a serenity that unsettled, of faith with a questioning that felt both reverent and rebellious, of love with a quiet intensity that trembled at the edges of restraint. Even those who had never heard her name found themselves arrested by the striking originality of her thought. The literary community was perplexed. Some celebrated her innovation, others dismissed her departures from conventional meter as weaknesses or peculiarities needing correction. Still others sensed that the true significance of her voice lay beneath the surface, in the silences between her words, in the strange compression that made her poems feel like riddles whispered against the ear of the universe. Her lines resisted the easy interpretations favored by 19th century criticism. They challenged readers to lean closer, to listen differently, to embrace ambiguity rather than clarity. And while some found this disorienting, others recognized that they were encountering something rare, a poet who had translated her solitude into a new grammar of emotional experience. But as her poems circulated in magazines, literary salons, and private parlors, the work itself was evolving in the hands of her earliest editors. They grouped her poems by theme, imposing categories such as life, love, nature, and time and eternity. They altered punctuation to conform to grammatical expectations. They substituted words when Emily had offered multiple variants or left final choices open. They introduced rhyme where she had created deliberate slant. They smoothed the jagged edges of her lines, edges that had been shaped with careful precision to capture the breathlessness, hesitation, or sudden illumination she intended. The result was a version of Emily Dickinson that was legible to her era, yet slightly veiled, a voice filtered through the sensibilities of those who wanted to improve her, not realizing that the unconventional style they sought to correct was the very essence of her genius. To contemporary readers, it might seem a sorrowful fact that her earliest public voice was not fully her own. Yet there is another way to see this moment, one that reflects the complexity of her emergence. The world was not ready for her original voice. Had her poems been published exactly as she wrote them in 1890, with their startling punctuation and elliptical meanings intact, it is possible they might have been dismissed outright, condemned as incomprehensible or unpolished. The softened versions, though imperfect, allowed readers to approach her gradually, to become familiar with her sensibility before encountering the full audacity of her craft. Her early editors, for all their missteps, opened the first doors into her world. They allowed her to be read, talked about, debated, puzzled over. They gave her a foothold in the literary consciousness of the time. Her emergence was not meteoric, but steady. Reviews ranged from fascinated to skeptical. Some readers returned to her poems repeatedly, drawn by the haunting echo of something they could not fully articulate. Others struggled with her unorthodox approach to theme and form. Yet with each year that passed, her reputation grew. New editions followed, more scholars took interest, and gradually the veil of editorial modification began to lift. Manuscripts were examined more closely, variants were compared. Scholars sought to restore her original punctuation, recognizing at last that the dashes were not decorative but structural, embodying the very breath of her thought. Letters she had written to friends and correspondents were published, adding depth to the understanding of her voice. A fuller picture began to emerge, one that revealed not a fragile recluse dabbling in poetry, but a fiercely inventive, intellectually daring poet whose work anticipated modernist and postmodernist innovations by decades. As the 20th century unfolded, Emily's reputation grew into something extraordinary. The more scholars studied her manuscripts, the more they recognized how far ahead of her time she had been. Her poems began to be read not as quaint or eccentric, but as foundational to the evolution of American poetry. She was seen as a pioneer of condensed language, a master of ambiguity, a poet whose relationship to form was radically experimental. Her themes, death, faith, longing, the inner life, were understood not as sentimental or morbid, but as profound engagements with the core questions of human existence. She became a touchstone for poets seeking to break free from tradition, a guiding spirit for writers exploring the edges of language, sound, and silence. And yet, even as recognition grew, the misunderstandings persisted in their own quiet way. Many readers adopted the image of Emily as a frail, melancholy recluse, a figure defined by gentleness and sadness rather than by the fiery intellectual force present in her writing. Others romanticized her white dress and isolation, reducing her complexity to a fragile symbol of purity or unrequited love. These misinterpretations, though often affectionate, reveal how difficult it is for the world to fully grasp a soul whose inwardness was both deeper and more daring than outward impressions suggested. Emily's seclusion became mythologized, even as her work revealed a mind attuned to the sharpest contours of thought and emotion. But beneath all these layers of misunderstanding, restoration, and re-evaluation lies the enduring truth. Her voice emerged. The poems she stitched, hid, protected, and left behind entered the world and reshaped it. They were transformed by early editors, misunderstood by many readers, celebrated by others, and eventually restored to something closer to the fierce, luminous truth she intended. And through this long, complex journey, her poetry proved resilient, strong enough to survive alterations, misunderstandings, and decades of obscurity, strong enough, ultimately, to reveal itself fully. Now, as we stand at the threshold of this moment, when her voice moves from softened echo toward its true cadence, the image of that early poem stripped of its dashes remains before us. It waits to be restored, to breathe again in the rhythm she intended. And as we turn from this image, we move into the next part of her story. How history, even in its admiration, often misremembers her, shaping myths that obscure the deeper truth of who she was. The unanswered question lingering at the end of her restored poems, who truly was Emily Dickinson, becomes the quiet doorway through which we now enter the chapter of her legacy, shaped not by what she wrote, but by what the world believed about her. For once her poems stepped into public consciousness, a curious alchemy occurred. Admiration wove itself with misunderstanding, reverence tangled with simplification, and the woman who had lived in one room became, in the eyes of history, an almost mythic figure defined less by truth than by projection. Her image, fragile and haunting, flourished in the imagination of readers who longed to understand her. Yet their very longing often led them to smooth the complexities of her life into symbols that bore only partial resemblance to the person she had been. And so, as her poems traveled farther from the quiet room where they were written, Emily herself became both more visible and more misunderstood, caught in the strange space where myth grows faster than memory. The most persistent misinterpretation cast her as a frail recluse, delicate, timid, withdrawn not by choice, but by fear or heartbreak. This image, though rooted in fragments of truth, obscured the agency that shaped much of her solitude. Her withdrawal from social life was not the consequence of fragility alone. It was also a deliberate response to her inner needs, an embrace of the quiet that nurtured her creativity. She chose silence over noise, depth over distraction, inwardness over conformity. Those choices, radical for her era, demanded strength, not weakness. Yet many early biographers, themselves shaped by Victorian ideals of womanhood, framed her seclusion as evidence of emotional dependency, spiritual fragility, or sentimental melancholy. They cast her as a tragic figure, a woman somehow broken by love or disappointed by life, overlooking the force of will and clarity of purpose that defined her daily existence. Others romanticized her as a woman undone by an unnamed, unfulfilled love, imagining her pining in her room for a lost suitor or forbidden affection. This myth, too, found fertile ground in the absence of explicit explanations in her letters and poems. Because Emily wrote of longing, yearning, separation, and emotional intensity, some readers assumed that these feelings pointed to a singular, dramatic romance. But love for her did not move along the predictable paths of narrative expectation. The emotional life revealed in her poems was profound yet dispersed, rich yet enigmatic, shaped by multiple bonds, intellectual, spiritual, emotional, that defied simple definition. To reduce her inner world to one story of heartbreak is to diminish the complexity of her affections, which were as layered and nuanced as her verse. Another misremembering cast her as an ethereal, otherworldly creature, gentle, saintly, almost angelic in her purity and quietness. This image, though affectionate, fails to account for her sharp wit, her occasional flashes of mischief, the dry humor that appears in her letters, the keen observational intelligence that could cut to the quick when she allowed it. Emily was not fragile glass. She was tempered steel wrapped in lace. Her solitude sharpened her insight, and she possessed a remarkable ability to perceive the small hypocrisies and vanities of the world without bitterness. She could laugh at human folly, her own included, and often did so with a wry tenderness that belied the stereotype of her as a somber recluse. Some even imagined her as a mystic, a figure removed from ordinary concerns, communing with nature and eternity, as if she were already halfway toward the next world. There is truth in this image. Much of her poetry engages with the metaphysical, the infinite, the unseen. She had a gift for perceiving the subtle pulse beneath the surface of things, yet to imagine her as detached from human experience is to miss the grounding reality of her life, her daily routines, her household duties, her bonds with family, her laughter, her frustrations, her imperfections. She lived fully in the tactile world even as she wrestled with mysteries far beyond it. In truth, the person who emerges from her poems and letters is far more complex than these simplified portraits. She was a woman of fierce intellect, capable of delight and despair, humor and solemnity, domestic devotion and spiritual rebellion. She lived in quietness but not passivity, in seclusion but not stagnation. She questioned religion, tested language, challenged poetic form, and explored the nature of consciousness with a daring that few recognized in her lifetime. She was not fragile. She was formidable. Her solitude was not emptiness. It was abundance. And her choice to live in one room was not a resignation, but a transformation. The creation of a world where thought could expand more freely than life beyond her door ever could. As scholarship grew over the 20th century, academics and readers began slowly peeling back the layers of myth that had settled upon her memory. Her manuscripts were examined more closely, revealing the boldness of her original forms. Her letters were studied not as sentimental curiosities, but as intellectual artifacts displaying mastery of language and psychological insight. Her fascicles were recognized as intentional, carefully arranged volumes rather than haphazard collections. And as her true voice emerged, through restored punctuation, preserved variant choices, and extensive analysis, so too did a truer portrait of her life. Readers discovered a woman who loved deeply, questioned boldly, and created tirelessly. They found a poet who confronted the largest questions without flinching, who carved out her own space in a world that gave women very little room for artistic independence. Yet even as these clearer understandings spread, the myths persisted in their own gentle way. They cling to her story not out of malice, but out of longing. People want Emily to be knowable, relatable, contained within the boundaries of a simple narrative. But she resists this. Her life, like her poetry, remains open-ended, filled with deliberate gaps and silences that invite interpretation without closure. She left behind no confessional diary, no exhaustive explanations, no definitive answers. Her poems reveal much, but conceal just as much. They are invitations to contemplation, not solutions. And so she remains, even now, a figure of mystery, one whose depths cannot be fully unraveled, one whose contradictions make her all the more compelling. Perhaps this is why she endures so powerfully in cultural memory. She cannot be confined to any single understanding. She was neither saint nor victim, neither mystic nor naive dreamer, neither simple recluse nor tortured genius. She was all of these things in fragments, in shifting proportions, illuminated by context and shadowed by silence. She crafted herself with intention, choosing which parts of her life to share, which to guard, which to express in the language of poetry rather than the language of prose. And history, even now, tries to understand her through these choices, interpreting the woman through the art she left behind. As we linger at the edge of these reflections, the question of how history remembers her and misremembers her remains suspended like a faint echo at the threshold of her legacy. And it is from this echo that we move into the final part of her story, where the room she once shaped becomes a timeless space, and her voice, unfinished in life, continues to resonate long after the door closed for the last time. The window left slightly ajar at the end of our last reflection becomes the quiet portal through which we step into the final part of this long, drifting journey, into the room that Emily Dickinson once inhabited, the room that now stands as both relic and symbol, holding the echo of a life shaped by solitude, intensity, and the shimmering mystery of unspoken depths. It is here, in this still space of wood and light and lingering silence, that her legacy gathers itself like a breath drawn in twilight, neither fully defined nor ever fully diminishing. To enter this room, whether in imagination or in the careful hush of the present-day house in Amherst, is to cross a threshold into a world that feels suspended between time and eternity, a world where the essence of her remains palpable, even though she herself has long since slipped beyond mortal boundaries. Visitors often describe the experience of standing in her room with a sense of quiet awe, noting the way the light falls across the floorboards or how the air seems to hold a faint expectancy, as though waiting for a step a whisper, a turn of the page. Nothing here is extravagant. The room is small, modestly furnished. A narrow bed neatly placed against the wall, a simple desk near the window, a few personal items that have survived the decades with careful preservation. Yet in this simplicity lies a vastness, for the room was the vessel that held her imagination, the landscape where she explored the infinite, the aperture through which she examined the secrets of nature, soul, sorrow, and hope. It was in this quiet space that she stitched together her fascicles by lamplight, capturing the fleeting brilliance of intuition before it dissolved into silence. It was here that she wrote lines that would outlive her by centuries, lines that would travel across oceans, languages, and generations, stirring minds far removed from the small orbit of her earthly life. To imagine Emily in this room during her lifetime is to see her moving slowly from desk to window, pausing to watch the shifting clouds or the trembling branches of the garden trees, her inward gaze tracing meanings invisible to others. One might picture her bending over her papers, her quill tapping lightly at the edge of a folded sheet as she shaped a thought too delicate for ordinary expression. Or perhaps she is standing, as some accounts suggest she often did, pacing the length of the room with soft steps as she murmured a poem to herself, testing the rhythm, sensing the breath of each line. These imagined glimpses, though incomplete, offer a sense of the living presence that once animated these walls, a presence filled not only with contemplation, but with an intensity that belied the outward quiet of her days. What lingers now in her room is not the ghost of a woman, but the resonance of her interior world. The room seems to remember her, not in any literal sense, but in the way spaces that have held profound human experience sometimes retain a quiet density. It is as though the air carries a faint afterglow of her thought, a softened vibration of her spirit. The light that slips through the window in late afternoon feels almost like a continuation of the light she once studied so closely, the same golden slant that she described in her poems, as though it were a language spoken only between her and the unseen. The quiet here feels purposeful, not empty, as though silence itself had been shaped by her into an instrument of perception. Her presence endures not only in the physical space she left behind, but in the poems that continue to circulate through the world, finding new readers who approach her with the same mixture of curiosity and wonder that she once invited in her own lifetime through the rare letters she sent. Each generation encounters her work differently. Some read her as a mystic, others as a proto-modernist, others as a philosopher of inward life. Some find comfort in her clarity, others in her ambiguity. Some are struck by the way she wrote about death as though it were a companion at her elbow. Others marvel at her sharp humor, hidden beneath the slant of her lines like a glimmering thread. Every reader finds a different facet of her, for her poems, like prisms, shift their colors depending on the light in which they are held. And yet, despite all that has been written, analyzed, restored, and debated, there remains an element of Emily that resists complete understanding. This resistance does not arise from deliberate concealment, though she was undeniably private, nor from lack of information, though many parts of her life remain unrecorded. Rather, it arises from the nature of her mind itself, from the way she perceived the world in flashes, fragments, and heightened sensations that cannot be fully reconstructed from the outside. She lived in a space between clarity and ambiguity, between revelation and withholding, between the ordinary rhythms of domestic life and the extraordinary landscapes of the imagination. Any attempt to define her entirely, to reduce her to one narrative, one archetype, one explanation, falls short, because her identity was composed of contradictions that were never meant to be reconciled. Consider the way she balanced her devotion to family with her fierce independence, or the way she combined a grounded domestic presence with an almost cosmic introspection. Consider how she could express longing so intensely while choosing a life that limited opportunities for physical companionship. Consider her profound spiritual questioning paired with a refusal to embrace organized doctrine. These contradictions were not signs of confusion, but reflections of the vast territory she inhabited internally. They were the raw materials of her art, the engines of her creativity, and because they remain unresolved, her legacy remains alive. An invitation rather than a statement, a doorway rather than a destination. In the centuries since her death, the world has continued to reinterpret her, as though each era feels compelled to ask anew, who was she? What did she see? Why did she choose the life she did? Scholars pore over her manuscripts, poets invoke her influence, readers carry her lines in their pockets, whispering them aloud in moments of quiet contemplation. She has become, paradoxically, both one of the most studied figures in American literature and one of the most elusive. Her room in Amherst, preserved with care, attracts thousands each year, yet no visitor leaves with a definitive answer. They all leave instead with a lingering sense of mystery, a feeling that her silence still speaks. This ambiguity, this perpetual incompletion, is perhaps her greatest gift. Emily Dickinson did not leave the world with a clear map of her mind or a neatly wrapped autobiography. She left us instead with poems that shimmer like half-remembered dreams, with letters that hint at emotions too large for the page, with spaces between words that echo longer than the words themselves. She left us with a room that feels at once empty and full, with a window that opens not only onto the Amherst landscape, but into the boundless realm of her inner vision. And so we conclude not with an answer, but with an image. The window slightly ajar, admitting a current of evening air that stirs the quiet of her room. The curtain lifts gently, revealing a slant of fading light. The house is silent. The pages in the drawer remain still, yet something in the air feels unfinished, as though her voice, though stilled, continues to breathe softly through the spaces she once inhabited. It is in this unfinished breath, this gentle uncertainty, that her legacy endures, carrying her voice across time like a faint, persistent echo, inviting each new listener to lean closer, to wonder, and to dream.